Hello, my dear friends. They were born into a world that never asked what they wanted. Their bodies were traded before they even knew what love meant, and their names were erased the moment they married. Beneath silk veils and church bells hid a truth far darker than fairy tales ever dared to tell. Every smile, every prayer, every child they bore came with a cost no man would ever pay. The Middle Ages looked holy on the outside, but it reeked of silent suffering behind every closed door. Tonight, you'll walk through that world with them and see what it truly meant to be a woman in the medieval age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If a girl was born into a medieval household, her future was never her own. From the moment she took her first steps, the course of her life had already been decided by men who saw her not as a person, but as a link in a chain of property and alliance. Marriages were arranged long before she understood the meaning of the word. Promises were made over wine cups, sealed by handshakes, and sometimes agreed upon before she had even learned to speak. When she grew older, the wedding would come as an announcement, not a choice. There was no romance, no courtship, and often no meeting beforehand. A man's family would send a token or a letter, and that would be enough to determine the rest of her life. In noble families, daughters were bargaining pieces. A father might secure land or military support by offering his child as part of the deal. In poorer homes, the arrangement was simpler, but no less cruel. The girl was a burden to feed, and marriage was a way to pass that burden to another man. It is darkly amusing that while men fought wars to defend their honour, they traded their daughters as though honour could be measured in livestock. In both castles and cottages, her worth was written in dowries, her body a currency of alliances and survival. The wedding day itself was more ritual than celebration. The bride might be carried to a church she had never entered, beside a man whose face she had barely glimpsed. Her gown, if she was fortunate enough to have one, was often chosen by others. It could be too large or too small, but it didn't matter. The ceremony was not about comfort or beauty, it was about property. Priests would bless the union while speaking of divine duty. Yet the words of God often sounded like the voice of commerce. The woman's consent was a quiet formality, spoken softly so no one would hear her hesitation. Once married, her name changed, her identity absorbed into her husband's. Documents would list her as wife of, her father's name erased, her own replaced by the man who now owned her. The home she entered was no refuge. It was a workplace where her labour was unpaid and her obedience expected. If she resisted, she risked punishment from both her husband and the church. The law offered no protection. A man could beat his wife without fear of consequence, as long as he claimed it was for discipline. The church preached patience and submission, telling women to bear their suffering as a test of virtue. In some regions, contracts even allowed the husband to return a bride if she was deemed unsatisfactory, as if she were a faulty tool. Her value was tied to her ability to bear children, especially sons. Each birth was both a duty and a danger. Women who failed to conceive or whose infants died were whispered about in the markets, accused of curses or sin. Some husbands abandoned or replaced them, seeking new wives who might bring better luck. Others simply took mistresses, leaving their wives to manage the household in silence. There were rare stories of affection growing after marriage, but these were exceptions, not expectations. A wife might learn her husband's moods, finding small ways to survive within his rules. She might steal moments of peace while he was away at war or in the fields. Yet even these brief freedoms were fragile. Her entire existence was watched and judged. Neighbours gossiped about whether she smiled too much at another man. Servants whispered that she spent too long alone. The same society that denied her choice also demanded her perfection. Among the peasantry, marriage brought not security, but another layer of labour. A woman worked the fields beside her husband, tended the animals, and raised children, all while enduring the weight of obedience. There was no escape in widowhood either. If her husband died, she might lose her home to his relatives. Everything she had built became someone else's possession once again. The law, the church, and tradition worked together to ensure she never stood alone. To think of this through modern eyes, it would be as if a young woman today were handed a contract by her parents, told to sign it, and informed that her signature would decide the rest of her life. The cruelty was hidden beneath the ceremony. Banners waved, bells rang, and people spoke of blessings. But beneath the surface, a quiet dread lingered in every bride's mind. Some wept behind veils. Others accepted their fate with blank eyes. Their silence was not agreement, only exhaustion. Each wedding marked another life handed over, another woman folded into the invisible machinery of patriarchal order. Even in literature, women who defied marriage were punished. Stories warned that disobedient daughters brought ruin to their families. Plays, songs, and sermons repeated the same message: a woman's virtue lay in submission. Generations grew up believing this was natural. The few who rebelled were branded sinners, witches, or mad women. The rest learned to smile when told who they would love, to thank their fathers for the future they never wanted. What unsettles me most is how normal this all seemed to them, how generations accepted bondage as destiny and called it honour. The illusion of order was more powerful than the truth of suffering, and even those who knew it was wrong often lacked the words or courage to name it. Marriage was supposed to unite families, but in truth, it divided humanity, drawing a line that women could not cross. Every vow spoken before the altar, every blessing uttered by a priest, was another brick in the wall that enclosed them. The girl who once played in her father's courtyard became a woman who could no longer walk freely without permission. She was both cherished and imprisoned, praised and silenced. In her wedding ring gleamed the reflection of chains too delicate for most to see, but too strong for her to ever break. The fate of medieval brides was not simply tragedy. It was a structure built to maintain control, to ensure obedience passed down through bloodlines. It tells us that suffering, when repeated often enough, becomes tradition, and that tradition can disguise itself as virtue. She had no choice but to accept, no power but endurance, and no witness but history itself. Her story did not end with vows. It only began there. The walls of her new home echoed with expectations she could never meet, and outside those walls waited a world that still refused to hear her voice. Somewhere in the distance, another child was already promised, another life quietly exchanged for a future she would never choose. Pregnancy in the medieval world was not a choice but a condition of existence. A woman's worth was measured by the children she could bear, especially sons, and her body was treated as a vessel for inheritance rather than a life of its own. From the moment she married, the rhythm of her life became one of endless conception and recovery, if recovery ever truly came. Her days were shaped by exhaustion, pain, and the quiet terror of knowing that every birth could be her last. The midwives who attended her had no tools beyond their hands, no knowledge beyond tradition. What they called a blessing was often suffering that never ended. Each pregnancy began with expectation but carried a shadow. The belly that swelled was a symbol of duty, not joy. Every neighbour watched, counting months, whispering judgments if too much time passed without another child. To be barren was shameful. To rest was selfish. To survive was an obligation. It is bitterly ironic that in a world ruled by faith, a woman's ability to create life was treated as a punishment rather than a miracle. Those who could not conceive were accused of sin, while those who conceived too often were blamed for weakness. Either way, There was no escape. Without knowledge of medicine or control over their own bodies, women endured the consequences of nature and neglect. No herbs or methods were safe. The remedies whispered among village women could cause fever, bleeding, or madness. Some chewed bitter roots, others tied charms around their waists, hoping to deceive fate. Most of these efforts failed, and the cycle continued. For many, their only wish was for a moment of stillness, a year, a month, even a week without fear of another child coming too soon. But the world did not listen. A pregnant woman was still expected to work. She harvested crops, fetched water, washed clothes, and bent over fields until her back stiffened. No allowance was made for her condition. If she complained, she was told to pray. Labour, both domestic and physical, continued until the moment her body gave out. When she miscarried, the response was silence. The lost child was rarely mourned, for loss was common, and compassion was scarce. What mattered was whether she could try again. If we compare it to today, it would be like forcing a woman to run a marathon every few months while being told it was her divine purpose to collapse at the finish line. The Church's teachings left no room for a woman's choice. Birth control was a sin, and even the thought of avoiding pregnancy was condemned. Men who violated their wives' bodies were excused as fulfilling marital duty, while women were scolded for lacking faith if they resisted. Priests preached that pain in childbirth was Eve's curse, proof of divine justice. To question that belief was to question God himself. And so, generation after generation, women prayed for mercy in a system designed to deny it. Inside small cottages, the air often smelled of damp straw and blood. Midwives worked by candlelight, cutting umbilical cords with knives meant for bread, wrapping the newborn in whatever cloth was near. If the child cried, it was a sign of hope. If it didn't, no one spoke. Mothers often drifted into fever, their faces pale against the dark wooden walls. Sometimes they survived, sometimes they didn't. The husband would stand by, silent and unmoved, already thinking of how soon another child might be conceived. Some women learned to hide their pregnancies for as long as they could. They worked through the pain, pretending strength, knowing that weakness could bring scorn. Others tried to end pregnancies in secret, desperate to avoid another mouth they could not feed. Those who succeeded bore guilt and fear, for the Church threatened eternal damnation. Those who failed were left with broken bodies, their suffering dismissed as moral consequence. I find it unbearable to imagine the quiet dread that filled those homes, where every blessing carried the weight of a funeral. The mortality rate was so high that families prepared burial cloths before birth. Mothers were told to confess their sins before labour, as if death were expected. Some kissed their other children goodbye without saying why. When they returned, it was either with a new baby in their arms or not at all. Death was not a shock, but a companion that lingered in every cradle. Even among the wealthy, privilege could not protect them. Noble women were confined to their chambers, surrounded by servants and prayers, but the danger was the same. Blood loss, infection, and stillbirth were as common in stone castles as in wooden huts. Medicine was ignorance cloaked in authority. No one truly understood the body, and superstition filled the gaps. A woman's suffering was sanctified, her death romanticized, her silence rewarded. There were few words for grief in that age. Life was too fragile to mourn for long. The midwives washed the sheets, the bells tolled, and the village returned to work. The husband remarried if his wife died young, and the pattern began again. Women knew this and faced it with resigned endurance. Their courage was not celebrated, their fear not acknowledged. The only legacy they left was in the children who survived, and even that survival came at a terrible cost. For those who lived through many pregnancies, old age came early, their backs bent, their faces hollowed, their bodies worn by years of carrying and loss. Some found comfort in faith, others in numb acceptance. The idea of control over their own lives was unthinkable. The cycle was eternal, passed from mother to daughter like a curse too heavy to break. Pregnancy was not the symbol of life it pretended to be. It was proof of a system that demanded women give everything: health, time, identity, and receive only pain in return. It was not creation, but consumption, taking and taking until nothing remained. In the medieval world, motherhood was never a choice, only a duty that devoured those bound to it. And while the church called it holy, the graveyard spoke otherwise. A woman's endless pregnancies told a story of strength mistaken for submission, of survival mistaken for faith. They marked her days with exhaustion and her nights with fear. Somewhere within that quiet suffering, a question began to form, fragile and forbidden, about what might happen if women ever stopped obeying. Childbirth in the medieval world was an act of survival rather than celebration. Most women gave birth in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by other women who had learned their craft through whispers and repetition, not study. There were no doctors, no antiseptics, no knowledge of how infection spread. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. A woman laboured on a straw mattress or cold floor, her screams muffled by prayers and superstition. If she lived, it was considered the will of God. If she died, it was also considered the will of God. There was no mercy in either outcome. The midwives who assisted were not trained in any modern sense. Their skills came from experience, passed down through generations, mixed with folk beliefs and rituals. They relied on herbs, chants, and intuition. Sometimes they helped save lives. Sometimes they caused more harm without knowing it. They worked with hands that were never clean, cutting cords with kitchen knives, wiping wounds with cloths already soaked in sweat. Infection followed quickly, and fevers rose within hours. For many women, childbirth did not end with birth but with death days later. Husbands were rarely present. Men believed the process was beneath them, a thing of women and pain. While the wife suffered, they waited outside, or sometimes not at all. A servant might be sent to deliver news of success or failure. The child mattered more than the mother. If it were a boy, there would be a celebration. If it were a girl, only silence. It is almost absurd how a society that preached family honour never truly cared about the one who made the family possible. The church viewed childbirth through a lens of morality rather than medicine. Pain was seen as divine punishment for Eve's sin, a trial meant to purify the soul. Women were told to accept suffering as holy. Doctors, where they existed, were forbidden from touching female patients, and so the cycle continued unbroken. The only guidance a woman received came from those who had survived before her, and even their knowledge was little more than guesswork. When complications arose, there was little to be done. A breech birth, a hemorrhage, or an infection almost always ended in death. The midwives tried to pray louder than the cries, hoping that faith would do what medicine could not. There were stories of mothers buried with their newborns still clutched to their chests, both claimed by the same night. These tales were whispered to young girls as warnings, not to prepare them, but to make them obedient. Fear was the only education they received about motherhood. In noble houses, the scene was not so different. The surroundings might have been grander, the sheets cleaner, but the ignorance was the same. Wealth did not protect against blood loss or infection. Physicians were called only after death was certain. They recorded the cause in Latin, adding a sense of dignity to what was simply neglect. If we compare it to today, it would be like giving birth in a room full of strangers who refuse to touch you out of piety and call your suffering a blessing. Mothers who survived often faced weeks of weakness, unable to walk or lift their children. Still, they were expected to resume work quickly. There was no recovery, no care, no rest. The same hands that had bled days before were soon washing clothes and stirring soup. Any sign of complaint was dismissed as vanity or laziness. Women were praised for endurance, not health. The more they suffered in silence, the more virtuous they were said to be. Those who lost their babies were blamed. People said they had not prayed enough, or that they had angered God. Misfortune was always the mother's fault. She bore the grief alone, often forced to attend Mass the very next morning, as if nothing had happened. Her tears were seen as weakness, her silence as acceptance. Many learned to hide both. It was safer to pretend that nothing had been lost. Over time, the fear of childbirth became a part of womanhood itself. Girls grew up hearing the screams of neighbours during labour. They saw women disappear after childbirth and never return. They learned early that motherhood was as dangerous as war, only quieter. Yet, unlike men who went to battle, women received no honour for their courage. Their battlefield was hidden behind walls, and their victories unspoken. For centuries, childbirth remained one of the most common causes of death among women. Generations passed without change. The church kept preaching, the midwives kept guessing, and the cycle went on. When reform finally arrived centuries later, it was too late for countless women whose lives had already been buried under faith and ignorance. I think what horrifies me most is how ordinary it all was, how calmly a society accepted death as the price of birth. Those mothers who survived often lived with damaged bodies, torn flesh, and chronic pain that no one cared to name. Some were left infertile, some unable to walk, and some haunted by the memories of the cries that faded into silence. Yet they continued to live, because living was the only resistance they could offer. The story of childbirth in the medieval world is not one of miracle, but of endurance beyond reason. Every breath taken by a new mother was defiance against the system that expected her to die. And though history has tried to romanticize it with hymns and paintings, the truth lies in the dirt floors and trembling hands of those who had nothing but hope. The pain of childbirth was not only a test of the body but a judgment upon the soul, wrapped in faith and neglect. It left scars that no one spoke of, turning survival into quiet heroism. And as life went on, something even crueler awaited those same women once the cradle was filled. Blame was a language everyone in the medieval world spoke, and women were its favourite target. When the rain failed, when crops rotted, when disease spread through villages, people did not look to the heavens for mercy. They looked to the women standing beside them. Faith taught them that Eve had cursed all her daughters, that sin entered the world through her disobedience. Every woman who lived after her carried that stain, an invisible mark that made her both necessary and dangerous. The church reinforced this belief at every sermon. Men were warned that temptation had a face, and it was female. Women were told that their only path to redemption was silence, obedience, and shame. Whenever disaster struck, fear demanded a scapegoat. Plague, famine, and storm all became excuses to hunt the supposed source of divine anger. The victims were rarely the powerful. They were widows, midwives, or anyone living too quietly on the edge of a village. Once accused, there was no escape. A glance, a birthmark, or a sudden illness in livestock could be enough to condemn a woman. Crowds gathered to watch as faith and violence merged into one spectacle. It is almost grotesque that people who prayed for forgiveness could burn a neighbour alive and call it devotion. Rumours moved faster than reason. A woman who healed the sick with herbs could be branded a witch. A woman who refused a man's advances could be called cursed. When the Black Death arrived, entire towns turned against their own, desperate to find a single sinner to punish for the wrath they did not understand. Fear made people cruel, and cruelty dressed itself in piety. There was comfort in believing that someone was to blame, even if that someone screamed for mercy. The church offered structure to this madness, turning superstition into ritual, trials by water, confession under torture, and public executions became sacred acts. Those who presided over them wore robes and crosses, believing they were cleansing the world of evil. But what they cleansed was often the last trace of compassion left in their communities. If we compare it to today, it would be like blaming every woman for a natural disaster while the leaders offered prayers instead of reason. In small villages, suspicion was a shadow that never lifted. A cow that stopped giving milk, a child who fell ill, a man who lost money at market. All these could be signs that a woman had angered God. No proof was needed, only fear. The accused were dragged from their homes, their possessions seized, their names erased. They were questioned until they broke, forced to admit to sins they never committed. Some confessed to witchcraft not because they believed it, but because pain made truth meaningless. Even those who escaped execution were never truly free. A single accusation could destroy a family's standing for generations. Children of the condemned grew up under whispers, marriage offers withdrawn, livelihoods lost. Communities that claimed to be righteous survived on the quiet terror of their own people. The church's sermons spoke of love, but its fires spoke louder. Behind the horror was a deeper irony. The same society that relied on women for care and survival accused them of spreading disease and death. When plague swept across Europe, women were the ones washing the sick, preparing bodies for burial, and feeding the dying. Yet when those same caregivers fell ill, it was said they brought the curse upon themselves. I find it deeply unsettling that a world so devoted to faith could see compassion as corruption and purity as a threat. The witch hunts were not only about fear of magic, but also fear of independence. A woman who lived alone was suspicious. A woman who owned property was dangerous. A woman who spoke too freely risked everything. The trials became a method of control disguised as divine justice. Each fire lit in the town square reminded others to stay quiet, to conform, to obey. Centuries later, records of these executions read like lists of forgotten names. They do not tell the fear in each breath, or the sound of a crowd cheering as flames rose higher. The victims were buried in unmarked graves, their stories erased except in the margins of court notes. History often treats them as curiosities, but each was a life taken by collective delusion. These persecutions were not isolated events. They became a cultural rhythm, repeated whenever fear needed a shape. Whether it was disease, infertility, or misfortune, the answer was always the same: blame the woman. Villages found comfort in her suffering, as if her death could lift the weight of their own sins. The fires went out, but the thinking behind them smouldered for centuries. Faith became a weapon sharpened by ignorance. It promised salvation but delivered control. For men, it was power dressed as holiness. For women, it was an invisible prison with walls built from guilt and suspicion. Even after the flames died, the idea survived that a woman was the source of everything fragile and wrong. The belief that women carried sin in their very nature did more than burn bodies. It burned empathy itself. It made cruelty righteous and ignorance sacred. And though the centuries have passed, echoes of that logic still linger whenever fear seeks an easy target. The fire that consumed the so-called witches did not just destroy flesh, it scorched truth itself. Each spark carried the illusion of purity while feeding the darkest parts of human faith. And somewhere in that smoke, a far more subtle cruelty was waiting to take its place. Knowledge in the medieval world was a privilege locked behind heavy doors, and women were never given the keys. From childhood, girls were taught to serve, not to think. Their lessons came from the kitchen, the loom, and the cradle. Books were not meant for their hands. Even among the nobility, where parchment and ink existed, education was reserved for sons. Daughters learned only what was needed to run a household, to speak politely, to obey. Their minds were expected to stay quiet, their curiosity hidden beneath the lace of humility. The church said wisdom was dangerous in a woman, for knowledge led to pride, and pride led to sin. A girl who asked too many questions was scolded for being bold. Reading was seen as vanity, writing as rebellion. In convents, a few women learned to copy scriptures, but even then, They were not allowed to interpret what they wrote. They traced holy words without the right to understand them. It is strangely laughable that an age obsessed with salvation believed ignorance could keep the soul pure. The control of knowledge was the control of faith, and women were kept at its edges, watching light through the cracks of doors they could never open. The few who managed to learn did so in secret. A father with a soft heart might let his daughter sit quietly at the back of a lesson meant for her brothers. A kind priest might teach her the alphabet between prayers. But such acts were rare and often condemned. For most women, letters remained a mystery, shapes that meant nothing, symbols of a world from which they were excluded. Without words, they could not record their lives, their thoughts, or their pain. History itself forgot them because they were never allowed to write it. In the towns, schools were places of male chatter and chalk dust. Boys learned to read contracts, to calculate, to preach. Women learned to mend, to spin, to cook. Their world was practical and narrow, designed to make them useful, not thoughtful. If we compare it to today, it would be like forbidding half of humanity from ever touching a book and then wondering why their voices were silent in history. Knowledge was treated as a weapon too sharp for women to hold, as if their minds might cut through the walls that contained them. The Church's control over education reinforced this division. Monasteries and universities were closed spaces for men, filled with scholars who debated philosophy and scripture. Women were told their salvation came not through study, but through obedience. The Virgin Mary was praised not for her mind, but for her silence. Any woman who sought learning beyond her domestic duties risked being labelled proud, dangerous, or worse, unholy. To be intelligent was to be suspect. Stories spread of women who defied this rule, writers, healers, philosophers, but they were treated as curiosities, not examples. Their achievements were often erased or credited to men. Some were accused of witchcraft simply because they knew too much about medicine or stars. Knowledge and danger became intertwined, and the fear of educated women took root so deeply that even centuries later it was still whispered as a warning. The cost of ignorance was more than silence. Without education, women were trapped in dependency. They could not read laws, contracts, or even letters sent by their husbands. They were at the mercy of others' interpretations, their lives managed by those who thought for them. When widowed, they were often cheated out of their inheritance simply because they could not read the papers that stole it from them. Every signature they gave was an act of blind trust, and often betrayal. The irony was cruel. Men praised women for being gentle, pure, and simple, then blamed them for foolishness when they made mistakes. A woman's ignorance was both demanded and punished. The few who tried to learn risked isolation, scorn, or even accusations of sin. Villages mocked educated women as unnatural, saying knowledge spoiled their modesty. The less a woman knew, the more she was praised. The absence of learning reached into every corner of life. Women passed down stories orally, fragments of memory distorted by time. Their wisdom lived in superstition, in songs, in whispered prayers. It was knowledge shaped by survival, not freedom. Yet even this was dismissed as inferior. The written word ruled the world, and women's words vanished like breath on cold air. Over centuries, this deprivation created an emptiness so vast that even history struggled to fill it. Libraries recorded the thoughts of men debating faith, war, and kingship, while women's voices lingered only as background echoes. They existed in men's writings as wives, mothers, temptresses, never as thinkers. The idea that a woman could hold a pen with purpose was seen as rebellion against the natural order. I can't help but feel that the greatest cruelty was not the denial of knowledge itself, but the belief that women did not deserve to want it. Even those who were born with sharp minds learned to dull them for survival. A clever girl might hide her thoughts behind a smile, knowing that discovery could mean ruin. Learning became an act of secrecy, reading a prayer to oneself in the dark. In this world, Silence was safety, and ignorance a shield forced upon them. As centuries turned, the darkness of unlearning remained heavy. The world that feared educated women continued to shape laws, churches, and families in their absence. What was lost was not just opportunity, but generations of thought, art, and truth that could have changed everything. The silence of women in the medieval world was not natural. It was engineered. It kept them invisible while convincing them they were unworthy of light. And as the world kept turning, another kind of obedience was waiting to take its place, one that reached into every corner of their daily lives. From the moment a girl could stand, she was taught that her hands existed for others. The rhythm of her life was built around service. Morning began before the men woke, and night ended long after they had gone to bed. She fetched water, fed animals, cleaned, cooked, spun, and mended, her movements unending and unseen. In noble homes and peasant huts alike, the pattern was the same. Her worth was measured by how much she could give and how little she could ask for in return. There was no title for her labour, no praise, only the assumption that she would always be there. She worked beside her mother as a child, obeyed her father without question, and when she married, she became the property of another man. The cycle of service passed from father to husband to son, binding her to every man in her life as though her body was not her own. Each command was to be met with quiet acceptance. Disobedience, even the smallest hesitation, was seen as defiance. The church called it duty. Society called it nature. It is darkly amusing that the same men who relied on women for every comfort insisted they were too weak to stand as equals. Her work stretched from the hearth to the fields. She lifted sacks of grain, gathered firewood, and knelt in the dirt until her knees turned raw. The seasons did not spare her, and illness was no excuse. A fever meant she moved more slowly, not that she stopped. Every bite of bread her family ate carried the weight of her unseen effort, and when she grew older, when her hands shook and her back bent, the world simply replaced her with a younger woman, another pair of hands to wear down. Meals were served first to men. The father ate before the mother, the sons before the daughters. Women ate what remained, often cold, little. In some homes, she stood while the others sat, her plate in her hand like that of a servant. Gratitude was rare, complaint was dangerous. The idea that she might rest was laughable. Her body was not seen as a living thing, but as a tool of endless use. Even in sickness, she worked. The same hands that trembled with fever still scrubbed floors and washed clothes. If we compare it to today, it would be like working every waking hour without pay, without breaks, and still being told it was your purpose to smile while doing it. The church praised such devotion, painting it as a holy act. A woman's labour, they said, was her offering to God. Priests spoke of the virtues of humility and obedience, telling women that service was a path to heaven, and so they toiled not just for men, but for their souls. Yet heaven was a distant promise, while the weight of their work was immediate. Their prayers rose from calloused hands, their faith carried in exhaustion. Even noble women lived within the same hierarchy, only surrounded by finer walls. Their duties were different but not lighter. They managed households, arranged feasts, oversaw servants, and endured the constant scrutiny of appearance and behaviour. Their obedience was more polished but no less absolute. The velvet dresses and jewelled hairpins only disguised the same truth, that their lives belonged to others. Mothers taught their daughters to be diligent, to anticipate the needs of men, and to apologize before being blamed. They did this not out of cruelty but survival. To question the system was dangerous. To challenge it was impossible. Generations of women passed down the skills of service like inheritance, teaching each other how to endure quietly, how to move unseen, how to exist without rest. The irony was that their labour held entire households together, yet they were never credited for it. Men signed contracts, made laws, and claimed authority. But behind every name carved in record books were countless hands that kept them alive. Without the women who spun the wool, baked the bread, and lit the fires, the medieval world would have fallen into chaos. But no one wrote their stories. Their work disappeared as soon as it was done. In the evenings, after the chores were finished, a woman might sit briefly by the fire, her back aching, her hands red from scrubbing. The silence around her was heavy. She would glance toward her sleeping family, the faces that depended on her, and then return to her mending. There was no applause, no gratitude, only waiting for the next morning. Her body carried the proof of her labour more than any record ever could. I often think that their quiet endurance was not submission, but a form of strength the world refused to recognise. There were no holidays for women. Festivals were still filled with tasks. While men drank, she prepared food. While they danced, she cleaned. While they rested, she watched the fires burn low so the house would not freeze. And when her husband grew old or ill, she became his caretaker too. The weight never lessened, it only changed shape. Generations later, history remembered kings, knights, and scholars, but not the women who kept them alive. Their names dissolved into the rhythm of daily chores, their existence woven into the fabric of work no one bothered to record. They lived lives of constant giving, and the world called it duty. A woman's life in the medieval home was not shaped by peace, but by endless motion. Her worth measured in how well she served and how quietly she suffered. Every act of care became another thread in a web that trapped her beneath a duty disguised as virtue. And beyond the walls of her labour, an even stricter boundary waited, where stepping outside alone could turn respect into disgrace. Freedom of movement was a privilege denied to women in the medieval world. The moment she stepped beyond her doorway, she entered a space that did not belong to her. The streets, markets, and roads were ruled by men's eyes, men's laws, and men's judgments. A woman walking alone invited suspicion before she even spoke. Every glance, every step, was measured and interpreted as a statement of character. She could not simply exist in public. She had to justify her presence there. If she lingered too long, she was idle. If she walked too quickly, she was improper. Her body became a public subject, and her behaviour a matter for others to decide. To travel alone was to risk her reputation, and in a world built on appearances, reputation was survival. Women were told that virtue lived in their walls, not in the open air. The church warned that temptation lay outside, that a respectable woman needed protection from both sin and rumour. Men used that belief to justify control. A daughter was escorted by her father, a wife by her husband, a widow by a relative or servant. Without a male presence, she was not seen as respectable. It is grimly ironic that the same society that claimed to guard women's purity made them prisoners in their own virtue. In towns, guards and priests watched with equal suspicion. A woman entering a market alone might be followed, questioned, or mocked. If she spoke to a stranger, it could be called flirting. If she smiled, it could be seen as an invitation. The boundary between innocence and accusation was paper-thin. Many women learned to walk with eyes down and lips closed, mastering the art of invisibility. To be unnoticed was to be safe. The less the world saw of her, the fewer chances it had to judge. Even noble women who lived behind castle walls felt the same confinement. Their movements were dictated by etiquette, their companions chosen for them. A lady could not ride through town without a chaperone, even to visit family or attend church. Her footsteps echoed only where permission allowed, and though her garments were made of silk and velvet, they served the same purpose as the rough wool of peasant women, to mark her place in a world where control was disguised as care. Travelling between towns or villages was nearly impossible. The roads were dangerous, and for a woman, danger was considered her fault. If she was robbed, she was careless. If she was assaulted, she was sinful. The law offered no sympathy. Women were expected to know better than to wander. Many who tried to escape their marriages or seek work elsewhere were caught and punished as vagrants or harlots. If we compare it to today, it would be like needing official permission just to buy food or visit a friend, and being condemned as immoral for going out alone. Religion gave moral weight to these restrictions. Priests taught that a woman's place was near the hearth, her safety dependent on obedience. The outside world was described as a space of temptation, filled with danger and corruption. Some even preached that women wandering alone brought bad luck, that their presence unsettled the balance of nature. This fear became law, and law became habit. Eventually, women stopped questioning why they could not walk freely, because freedom had been rewritten as sin. Those who dared to break this rule paid a heavy price. A woman seen alone at night could be accused of witchcraft or prostitution without evidence. Once accused, her word meant nothing. Gossip spread faster than truth, and a single rumour could ruin her life. Husbands abandoned wives who brought shame through public suspicion. Fathers disowned daughters to protect the family name. Silence and submission became survival strategies, passed down through generations like a curse. The irony of this fear was that it existed alongside women's constant labour. They walked to markets, wells, and fields daily. But those movements were invisible because they served men's needs. The act of walking became acceptable only when it was for others. A woman carrying water was dutiful. A woman walking without purpose was dangerous. Freedom depended not on distance, but on intent, and her intent was never trusted. In villages, mothers warned their daughters never to meet another's gaze, never to pause where they might be noticed. Men spoke freely in the streets, laughing, shouting, gathering in groups, while women stayed close to walls and shadows. They knew the difference between safety and scandal could be as small as being seen in the wrong place. Even a simple greeting could become evidence of temptation. Over time, these invisible rules shaped the way women moved. Their steps became smaller, their paths predictable. They learned to make themselves small in public, to vanish within their tasks. The freedom to walk, to wander, to explore, the most basic form of human liberty, was stripped away and recast as danger. The world outside the home was not forbidden by law alone, but by fear itself. I often think that what they called protection was nothing more than fear made holy. Generations of women lived and died within these boundaries, their feet tracing the same limited routes from home to church, from market to well. To exist safely meant never being seen. The roads that carried men to trade, war, and pilgrimage were never meant for them. And in every story written by men of brave travellers and adventurers, women existed only as waiting figures, bound to thresholds they could not cross. The medieval woman's world ended where her doorway began, a border drawn not in stone but in judgment. Each forbidden step reminded her that freedom was not for her kind. Yet beyond those narrow streets, another form of captivity waited, one that turned her very body into the property of others. To be born a woman in the medieval world was to belong to someone before you could even speak. A girl entered life already claimed, her existence defined by the man whose name she carried. Her identity was never her own. First, she was her father's daughter, then her husband's wife, and later, if she was unlucky enough to outlive them both, she became someone's widow. No name belonged to her alone, no document that declared her as an individual. Her life was a chain of ownership, politely disguised as family. A woman's worth was not measured by her thoughts or character, but by what she brought into a marriage. Dowries, lands, or alliances turned her into a living transaction. She could be gifted, traded, or pledged to secure loyalty between men. The arrangement was often made long before she reached adulthood. On her wedding day, she was presented not as a person, but as an asset. The marriage contract was signed by fathers, witnessed by priests, and sealed by God. No one asked her opinion. It is almost absurd how a society that praised chivalry treated women like objects in the same breath. Once married, She ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Her possessions, if she had any, passed to her husband. Her labour, her earnings, her very body were all absorbed into his authority. In public records, her name appeared only as a note beside his. Her signature held no legal weight. The Church reinforced this structure, teaching that a wife owed obedience to her husband as a subject owed to a king. To disobey was to sin. To submit was to serve both man and God. Even noble women, surrounded by wealth and luxury, were not free from this captivity. Their titles came from men, their estates managed by stewards, their fates tied to politics they could not control. When a lord died, his widow was often forced to remarry quickly, not for love or security, but to ensure that property stayed within reach of male hands. She might be passed to a new husband, like the land she lived upon. If she refused, she risked losing everything. If we compare it to today, it would be like transferring ownership of a house, a fortune, and a life all in the same document, with the owner's consent assumed by silence. For poorer women, the system was even harsher. A peasant's wife had no land in her own name, even if she worked the soil daily. The fields she sowed, the animals she tended, and the house she kept all belonged to her husband or his lord. If he died, the land reverted to another man, and she became a burden to his family. Widows were often remarried quickly or sent away to survive as servants or beggars. Freedom was never a possibility, only a different form of dependence. The church and the courts worked together to preserve this structure. They called it order. They said it kept society stable, that God had created men to rule and women to obey. Legal documents referred to women as chattels, property attached to inheritance. A father could offer his daughter as payment for debt, or as a political gift. Her feelings were irrelevant, her future predetermined. The irony was that even as men wrote laws to protect their property, they never saw that they were writing the same laws that stripped half the population of personhood. A woman without a male guardian was considered dangerous. Her independence was a threat to the system. Widows who managed their own affairs were often watched closely, suspected of greed or sin. The mere act of existing without a man's authority made them targets of gossip. Society feared women who stood alone because they proved that ownership was not destiny. The easiest way to erase that proof was to control them again. In markets and courts, women were invisible. They could not sign contracts, testify in trials, or defend themselves without a man's voice to speak for them. Their silence was written into law, their obedience enforced by both custom and fear. Even in death, their names were recorded beside men's, never as separate lives. Their tombstones often read a wife of or daughter of, as though existence itself was something borrowed. This ownership extended beyond property. A woman's body belonged not to her but to the will of her husband. The church sanctioned marital rights that ignored consent, teaching that refusal was sin. Even her fertility was treated as a household resource. Her children a means of securing lineage. To love, to rest, to refuse. These were not her choices to make. Every part of her life was defined by what she could give, never by who she was. There were, of course, exceptions whispered through history. A widow who managed to hold her late husband's land, a merchant's wife who kept the books, and a nun who wrote letters under anonymity. But these women survived only by bending rules quietly, never breaking them publicly. Their victories were fragile and easily erased. Most lived in fear that one accusation, one rumour, could undo everything. What made the system so enduring was how normal it felt. Girls grew up believing that dependence was safety. Mothers told daughters to be obedient, to marry well, to stay within their boundaries. The illusion of protection hid the truth of ownership. The home was a cage built with care, and the comfort it offered came at the price of freedom. I think the cruelty lay not just in control, but in how beautifully it was disguised as love. Women were born into men's names and died beneath them. They built the world's foundations without ever standing upon them. Their value was counted in alliances, heirs, and dowries, never in dignity. The system thrived on their silence, shaping centuries of belief about what women could be. In the medieval world, a woman's name was never her own. Her life was bound by the hands that claimed her. She lived and died as property passed from one man to another, and in that quiet exchange, an entire civilization learned to mistake possession for love. But the next cruelty would cut even deeper, reaching into the most private parts of her daily life. Cleanliness for a woman in the medieval world was not a matter of choice but of circumstance, and most circumstances were cruel. The idea of personal hygiene barely existed, and for women it was bound tightly to shame. There were no private rooms for bathing, no warm water waiting in polished basins. Bathing, when possible, happened in public bathhouses shared by strangers, or in cold rivers under a sky that showed no mercy. Modesty clashed with survival. To keep clean meant exposure. To hide meant filth. Either way, she was condemned. In most homes, especially among the poor, water was scarce and considered dangerous. People feared that bathing opened the body to illness. Women, taught to obey, bathed only when told to or when filth became unbearable. Even then, the act was quick and hidden. A wooden tub, a bucket of water, and a few scraps of linen were all she had. Soap, when available, was made of animal fat and ash, rough enough to tear skin. The water cooled fast, and privacy was impossible. Her family might wait outside the door, or the neighbours might pass by the open window. Her body was never her own, not even in moments meant for care. Cleanliness became a privilege of the wealthy, but even noble women faced limitations. Their baths were rare and ceremonial, prepared by servants in dim candlelight. The scent of rose water could not mask a decay. Perfume replaced washing, powders covered dirt, and silk gowns brushed against skin that had not been cleaned for weeks. It is almost darkly comical that an era obsessed with virtue could not tell the difference between holiness and hygiene. The lack of sanitation was more than discomfort. It was danger. Parasites, infections, and skin diseases spread easily. Women who spent their days in fields or kitchens were surrounded by grime. Their hands cracked, their hair matted, their clothes stiff with sweat and dust. They learned to ignore the discomfort because there was no alternative. The idea of freshness belonged to another world, one they would never see. Menstruation carried its own humiliation. There were no sanitary products, only scraps of cloth washed and reused until they disintegrated. Poorer women used straw, moss, or rags torn from old garments. The process was painful and filthy, but necessity left no choice. Blood was a reminder of their impurity, a physical mark of what the church called Eve's curse. During this time, women were often sent away, made to sleep apart, or forbidden from entering churches. Some believed even their touch could spoil food or crops. If we compare it to today, it would be like being quarantined every month for simply existing as a woman. The shame surrounding menstruation silenced women further. They hid stains, concealed pain, and worked through cramps without pause. No one spoke of it openly. Even mothers avoided the topic, passing down secrecy as part of inheritance. When girls first bled, they learned not of health, but of guilt. They were told to pray, to cleanse their souls rather than their bodies. The church linked purity to control, convincing women that natural functions were sins in disguise. In villages, where water was drawn from shared wells and baths were a luxury, cleanliness depended on the weather and will. During harsh winters, washing was almost impossible. Frozen rivers and cold air made even the thought unbearable. A woman might go months without bathing, her hair oily, her skin layered with dirt. The stench of life became part of existence. People grew used to it, and no one questioned why. Pregnancy and childbirth made hygiene even more critical, yet nothing improved. Women gave birth on straw beds, surrounded by filth that bred infection. Afterward, they were too weak to clean themselves, and the cycle continued. Illnesses that could have been prevented with simple washing often led to death. The same community that judged women for impurity did nothing to make cleanliness possible. Even among the elite, purity was symbolic, not physical. Ritual washing before prayer mattered more than actual cleanliness. The soul was expected to be spotless, even as the body rotted beneath layers of perfume and cloth. Servants washed their mistresses' faces and hands before banquets. But the illusion stopped there. The rest of the body remained hidden and ignored. The line between cleanliness and pretense was thin and often invisible. For many women, bathing became an act of defiance. It was the one time they touched their bodies without permission or purpose beyond survival. In that brief moment, they remembered that they were human. But even that memory faded quickly once the water cooled and duty called again. I think what is most tragic is that they were made to feel guilty for wanting the simplest form of dignity. The result of such neglect was more than physical decay. It shaped how women saw themselves. They were told their bodies were dirty, their nature corrupt, their needs shameful. By denying them the means to stay clean, society reinforced its control. A woman stripped of comfort was easier to humble, easier to convince that her suffering was divine order. Centuries later, history would romanticize the medieval age with tapestries and stories, but none of those colours could hide the truth that life itself smelled of sweat, rot, and resignation. Cleanliness was never just about water or soap. It was about worth, and women were told they had none. In the medieval world, a woman's body was never her own. Her skin was wrapped in the dust of obedience and the weight of sin. She lived without the right to care for herself, taught to fear the very act of feeling clean. And as her body suffered, another cruelty emerged, one that turned her pain into blame. Violence against women in the medieval world was not seen as a crime, but as an inconvenience, something to be silenced before it disturbed the illusion of order. When a woman was violated, the question was never what had been done to her, but what she had done to deserve it. Her suffering was examined as though it were evidence of guilt. The church preached chastity, men demanded obedience, and society watched in judgment. The act itself was only part of her punishment. The rest came afterward, through whispers, accusations, and shame. No law existed to protect her voice. Courts were built for men, by men, and around the words of men. For her claim to be heard, she needed witnesses, male witnesses. Without them, she was nothing more than a rumour. Even when the crime occurred in daylight, her attacker could deny it easily. The logic was simple and cruel. A man's word weighed more than a woman's body. It is painfully absurd that a society built on faith in justice could not imagine truth coming from a woman's mouth. Victims were often told that silence was mercy. Families urged them to keep quiet, not out of compassion, but to protect their reputation. If the story spread, the shame would stain them all. Many girls were forced to marry their rapist to preserve appearances. The marriage, they said, made the act legitimate, erased the sin. To the church, consent after the fact redeemed the offence. The man kept his honour, and the woman lost what little she had left. For the poor, the situation was worse. Women without family protection were left defenceless. If they spoke, they were mocked. If they resisted, they were punished. Some were accused of seduction, of tempting men through their clothing or manner. The burden of proof was impossible. A woman could not cry out without being blamed for her own voice. If we compare it to today, it would be like a world where theft is excused because the victim dared to own something worth taking. Even noble women, shielded by rank, face the same disbelief. Power did not protect them from accusation, only hid the scandal more quietly. Their attackers were often men of equal or higher status, untouchable by law. The church and nobility shared the same silence, trading morality for convenience. The lesson was clear: a woman's body could be violated, but her complaint could not. The language of sin further twisted the blade. Priests told women that their purity was fragile, easily broken by thought or gaze. If they were attacked, it was seen as divine punishment, a reflection of hidden fault. Their pain was made spiritual, their trauma called a lesson. Confession replaced justice, and repentance replaced healing. They were taught to pray for forgiveness rather than demand it. The consequence of such logic was isolation. Women carried their wounds in secret, knowing that to speak was to be destroyed twice, once by violence and again by disbelief. Their neighbours would avoid them, and their families would turn cold. Whispers followed them through markets and churches. No one saw them as victims, only as reminders of sin. Some fled to convents, hoping for peace, but even there, they were reminded that silence was holiness. In villages, stories spread of women who were too bold, who invited attention. Men used these tales as warnings. Mothers repeated them to daughters. Fear became protection. Women learned to move quietly, to avoid eye contact, to shrink within their clothing. Their safety depended on invisibility. Yet even that was never enough. A passing insult, a look held too long, could undo everything. The most devastating truth was that many accepted this as normal. Generations of women grew up believing their pain was inevitable, their suffering divinely ordained. To question it was to question faith itself. The system thrived because it convinced women that silence was a virtue. The more they endured, the holier they became, and so a cycle of injustice was wrapped neatly in the language of morality. I think what chills me most is how ordinary it all was, how people could speak of love, faith, and God while ignoring the cries that echo through their own streets. Those who tried to resist or accuse powerful men often disappeared. Some were sent to nunneries under the pretense of repentance, others simply vanished. Their names faded from records, leaving behind only the shadows of what might have been justice. The men continued their lives untouched, their sins forgiven by confession or forgotten through wealth. The church prayed for souls, not for fairness. Over time, the fear of blame became stronger than the fear of violence itself. Mothers told their daughters not to walk alone, not to laugh too loudly, and not to wear colours that drew attention. They built cages from caution, believing them to be protection. The blame passed down like an inheritance, shaping how every woman carried herself. The streets belonged to men, and women moved through them as trespassers. This culture of silence endured for centuries, its echoes carried in laws, in sermons, in art that praised purity while punishing reality. The belief that women were the cause of sin, not its victims, became part of the world's foundation. Every story told by men reinforced it. Every sermon sealed it deeper. In the medieval world, a woman's pain was never her own. It was evidence against her, a burden she was expected to carry with grace. Her body was the crime, her silence the sentence. And after enduring such blame, she still had to wake each morning to serve the very men who condemned her. Work for a medieval woman was never a path to freedom, only another form of obedience. Her labour filled every corner of life, yet it was never considered a profession. The world decided early what she could and could not do, and every rule favoured the men who made them. She could spin wool, weave cloth, bake bread, or serve in silence. But to earn a real wage, to hold a craft in her own name, was forbidden. The boundary between labour and livelihood was drawn by gender, not skill. Women worked from dawn to dusk, but their effort was seen as duty, not contribution. In towns, guilds controlled the trades. Each one was a fortress guarded by men who called themselves craftsmen. They passed their knowledge from father to son, and the door stayed closed to women. Even when a woman had talent, she could only use it in secret or under her husband's name. A widow might inherit his workshop temporarily, but she was expected to remarry quickly so the craft could return to male hands. Independence was tolerated only as a pause between ownerships. It is bitterly funny that the world that relied on women's labour treated it as invisible until a man claimed it. The church and the law reinforced these limits. They said it was improper for a woman to handle money or run a business. To do so was to invite temptation, pride, or corruption. The language of sin became the language of control. Women were told that their work should serve others, not themselves. Markets and trades were filled with men shouting prices, while women stood quietly at the edges, selling scraps, thread, or food, just enough to survive. They were workers without recognition, labourers without titles. In rural areas, the situation was harsher. A farmer's wife worked the fields, cared for animals, and managed the household. Her labour was equal to that of her husband, sometimes greater, yet the harvest was never hers. The tools belonged to him, the profits too. She was the engine of survival in a world that denied her the name of worker. Every loaf of bread she baked, every sack of grain she carried, was a testament to endurance mistaken for obligation. Some women tried to defy the rules. They opened small shops, sold goods, or practiced crafts learned through years of observation. But defiance was costly. Men accused them of greed or deceit, claiming that women who sought independence were dangerous. The church called them prideful. The markets called them thieves. Their success invited resentment, and their failure confirmed every prejudice against them. If we compare it to today, it would be like being punished for working hard simply because the work proved you did not need permission. Even among the wealthy, work was disguised as virtue. Noble women oversaw estates, managed servants, and organised households as efficiently as any merchant ran a business. But their labour was described as a moral duty, not a skill. The world could not admit that women were capable of management or intellect, because doing so would threaten its entire structure. The illusion of male superiority was too fragile to survive acknowledgement of women's competence. Education, already rare, made progress impossible. Without literacy, women could not keep accounts, read contracts, or negotiate trade. Even those who could read were discouraged from using that ability outside the home. A woman who showed ambition was labelled unfeminine. Ambition itself was treated like a sin when worn by a woman's heart. Men guarded professions not because women were incapable, but because they knew women were indispensable. Control was easier than competition. The hypocrisy extended into religion. Nuns, who lived lives of labour and discipline, produced textiles, manuscripts, and medicines that sustained entire communities. Yet their work was credited to the church, not to them. Their names were erased, their achievements folded into the institution that kept them cloistered. Faith took their effort, called it devotion, and left them anonymous. For ordinary women, work was survival without reward. Their bodies aged quickly, their hands hardened, and their backs bent from years of effort unacknowledged. A lifetime of labour earned them neither wealth nor respect. Society demanded that they give everything, then pretended they had given nothing. Men inherited trades, names, and legacies. Women left behind only calluses. Still, there were moments of quiet rebellion. A midwife who charged for her services, a weaver who sold cloth under another's name, a widow who refused to remarry. These women existed at the edge of defiance, holding small pieces of independence that the world tried to take. They remind us that the desire for autonomy is not new. It has always burned quietly, even under the weight of centuries. I think what defines their strength is not what they achieved, but the courage to want more in a world that taught them not to. Every spindle turned, every loaf sold, every task completed without credit was an act of survival that built the foundation of society. Yet history remembers only the hands that signed the contracts, not the ones that made the goods. Women worked tirelessly, while the world insisted they did not work at all. The medieval woman's labour was the pulse that kept her world alive, but she was forbidden from claiming its rhythm. Her work fed kingdoms that denied her name, and when she dared to stand alone, they called her a rebel, and within that rebellion, a darker danger waited, one that could turn knowledge and skill into death sentences. To stand out as a woman in the medieval world was to invite danger. The line between admiration and accusation was drawn so thin that a whisper could destroy a life. A woman who was too confident, too intelligent, or simply too visible risked being called unnatural. The world had a name for women who did not fit its quiet mould. It called them witches. The accusation needed no proof, only fear. A single rumour could spread faster than truth, and by the time her innocence was considered, it was already too late. In a society that prized obedience, a woman's independence was its greatest threat. The roots of this terror grew from ignorance and superstition. Illness, crop failure, or sudden death demanded explanation, and people found it easier to blame someone they could see than to face what they could not understand. Women were convenient targets because they had no voice, no protection, and no right to defend themselves. A widow living alone might be accused of owning a cat or tending a garden. A midwife who saved lives could be condemned for knowing too much about the body. A woman who healed the sick with herbs was said to consort with the devil. It is almost absurd that an age claiming to serve God feared knowledge more than evil itself. Once suspicion took hold, it spread like smoke. Neighbours avoided her door, priests prayed against her, and local officials prepared the trial. Torture was used not to find truth, but to create it. A confession extracted through pain was considered divine proof. The accused was stripped, examined for marks of the devil, and paraded before her own community. The shame was as cruel as the punishment. The crowd watched as she was humiliated, her fear mistaken for guilt. In the eyes of the law, a woman's terror confirmed her crime. The church played its part, turning superstition into order. Preachers warned that Satan worked through women because they were weak in mind and spirit. Books written by clergymen described how to identify and punish witches, filling pages with contradictions that left no one safe. If a woman was beautiful, she tempted men. If she were old, she envied youth. If she were poor, she sought power. If she were rich, she gained it through sin. No matter who she was, she could not escape suspicion. If we compare it to today, it would be like living in a world where being intelligent or independent could be tried as a capital offence. The trials were theatre disguised as justice. Town squares filled with spectators eager for spectacle, not truth. The accused were tied to chairs, dunked into rivers, or burned in fields. Survival meant guilt, and death meant proof of innocence. The logic was cruelly perfect. It killed without question, and justified every corpse with prayer. Those who hesitated to participate were suspected of sympathy. In this way, fear forced even the innocent to become accomplices. For many, the accusation was not random. It was a tool of revenge, jealousy, or control. A husband tired of his wife's defiance could call her a witch and rid himself of her legally. A neighbour who envied another's land or possessions could whisper lies that spread like fire. The system made cruelty easy and virtue meaningless. Truth did not matter when belief was stronger, and belief, once formed, could not be undone. The women who fell victim to these hunts came from every class and age. Some were midwives, healers, or widows. Others were simply unlucky. Their common trait was visibility in a world that demanded silence. They existed too boldly, too freely, too differently. Even their smallest actions, reading, laughing alone, speaking without permission, could be twisted into proof of darkness. The fires that burned their bodies were fed by centuries of fear disguised as faith. There were no safe places. Even convents, once refuges for women, became dangerous. Nuns accused of visions or prophetic dreams were sometimes punished as heretics. The church that promised protection became another hand of judgment. It was safer to be ordinary, to fade into routine, to make oneself invisible. Those who survived learned the art of disappearing while still living. They walked quietly, dressed plainly, spoke softly. They became shadows of themselves to stay alive. In some villages, the memory of these accusations never faded. Fields where women were executed became cursed ground. Children were told not to play there, yet they whispered the stories in secret. The fear passed down generations, shaping how women behaved long after the flames went out. To be quiet was not just respect, it was self-preservation. The message was clear: live small, or be destroyed. Even centuries later, records of witch trials show not justice but mass hysteria preserved in ink. The written testimonies read like confessions made under nightmares. Women admitted to crimes they could not have imagined, describing meetings with demons invented by their torturers. History books would later call it ignorance, but at the time it was order. It was the law. It was what kept men comfortable in their certainty that they were righteous. I find it haunting that generations could worship purity while setting fire to the women who embodied it in their strength. The cost of these accusations was more than death. It erased trust, broke families, and taught entire societies that women's power must be controlled. The aftermath was silence, a deep, generational silence that seeped into how women carried themselves. Every act of thought, care, or learning became shadowed by fear. The fires went out, but the fear they lit smouldered in memory. The witch hunts were not only about superstition but about power. They gave men authority to judge, punish, and possess under the banner of righteousness. A woman's independence, however small, became evidence of evil. Her suffering was not seen as a tragedy, but as a purification. Her ashes were considered holy proof that sin had been removed from the world. The truth was simpler and far darker. The church did not fear witches. It feared women who did not need permission to live. In the quiet after execution, life continued as if nothing had happened. The marketplace reopened, children played, bells rang for mass. But beneath the calm surface, the scent of burned bodies lingered in the wind. It reminded everyone that safety depended on obedience. The witch became a symbol of everything forbidden knowledge, autonomy, and courage. The accusation destroyed countless lives, yet it also revealed a truth the world tried to hide, that women who dared to be visible were powerful, and power, in the medieval mind, was unforgivable. To stand out was to die, and to survive was to disappear. The world called it justice, but it was fear turned into ritual. Yet long after the fires died, another kind of control emerged, one that did not need flames to keep women in their place. It only needed faith wrapped in law. Marriage in the medieval world was not a union of love but a contract of endurance. Once a woman entered it, there was no escape, no forgiveness, no right to begin again. The church taught that marriage was sacred and unbreakable, binding husband and wife together until death. But the vow was not equal. For men, it was a promise of possession. For women, a sentence of obedience. If her husband was cruel, violent, or unfaithful, she was told to pray, to submit, to accept that suffering was part of God's plan. The wedding ring became a shackle hidden beneath the language of holiness. A woman who tried to leave her husband found every door closed. The law recognized her as his property, her life and labor absorbed into his name. Even when his abuse was known, society called it private business, not a crime. The church declared that a wife must endure, that patience purified the soul. Her bruises were seen as tests of virtue, her silence as proof of faith. It is almost grotesque how a world obsessed with sin excused the cruelty committed inside its most holy institution. If a man grew tired of his wife, he could send her away under the guise of separation, or take another woman under protection. The church turned a blind eye so long as he maintained the appearance of piety. But if a woman even whispered of leaving, she was condemned. To abandon her husband was to abandon her salvation. Priests told her that disobedience would condemn her soul to eternal fire. Her pain was not seen as injustice but as divine correction. For most women, marriage began in ignorance and ended in captivity. Many were married young, often to men they barely knew. Their families arranged it for wealth or status, not affection. Once wed, they were transferred like property from one household to another. Their new lives were filled with labour, service, and expectation. If their husbands turned violent, there was no refuge. To seek help was to invite disgrace. Villages whispered, neighbours judged, and even relatives urged her to return home quietly. The church's power made this cruelty absolute. Divorce was considered an affront to God's design, a rebellion against divine order. The only path to separation was annulment, a process available only to the rich and powerful. Common women had no such luxury. Even noble women, trapped in loveless or abusive marriages, had to beg the Pope for mercy. Most petitions were denied. Those few granted were justified not by compassion but by politics. If we compare it to today, it would be like asking a government to approve your freedom from harm and being told that your suffering keeps society stable. The idea of marital duty was drilled into every girl from birth. She was taught that her husband was her master, her judge, her mirror of God on earth. To question him was to question heaven itself. Sermons told women that obedience was their path to virtue. If her husband beat her, it was because she had angered God. If he humiliated her, she was told to pray for humility. No version of her suffering ended in blame. The violence took many forms, including striking, confinement, and deprivation. A husband could control his wife's movements, money, and speech. He could lock her away, take her children, and still be considered righteous. The few women who fled their homes were hunted down and returned by law. Some joined convents for safety, though even there, they were haunted by guilt for abandoning their vows. Others disappeared entirely, their names erased from records, their existence reduced to rumour. The most tragic part was how ordinary it all became. Communities accepted abuse as natural, even necessary. The bruised wife who covered her face with a cloth, the mother who flinched at a raised hand. These were familiar sights, not scandals. The church preached endurance, calling it grace. Pain was sanctified, and submission was salvation. The world looked at suffering and saw devotion. Yet despite this, some women resisted quietly. A few sought justice in local courts, appealing to priests or bishops, hoping someone would listen. Their words were often dismissed, but occasionally a sympathetic cleric granted temporary protection. These moments of mercy were rare and fleeting. Once the scandal faded, they were sent back to their abusers, told to reconcile in the name of peace. Their courage went unrecorded, their pain sanctified into silence. Among the nobility, stories of manipulation replaced outright violence. A husband could imprison his wife in her chambers, cut her off from letters or visitors, and claim she was ill. Her wealth, dowry, and inheritance remained his to control. Some of these women wrote secret letters, smuggled through servants, pleading for release. Their words still exist in fragments, buried in archives. They reveal a truth that history tried to forget, that even behind stone walls and fine gowns, women lived as prisoners. In the rarest cases, women turned to rebellion. Some fled to cities under false names, working as servants or weavers. Others joined travelling troops or religious movements that preached spiritual equality. These acts of escape were dangerous, punishable by exile or death. But even a moment of freedom, even one breath outside the confines of control, was worth everything. I think what lingers most painfully is how faith, meant to protect love, became the weapon that destroyed it. As centuries passed, the belief in indissoluble marriage continued to haunt generations. Women inherited their mother's silence, their daughters learned to fear their husband's moods. The cycle of control disguised itself as tradition, and tradition became law. The world spoke of divine love but built its foundations on female suffering. The Church would later claim that such rules preserved morality, that they kept families whole, but the truth was simpler. Keeping women bound meant keeping power balanced in men's favour. Every sermon about patience, every hymn about obedience, was another chain forged from piety. It was not holiness, it was hierarchy. Marriage, in its purest form, should have been a partnership. In the medieval world, it was ownership sanctified by prayer. The vows that were meant to unite two souls became the words that trapped one, and for countless women, death was the only true divorce the Church allowed. For medieval women, marriage was both sanctuary and cage, its vows carved deeper than flesh, beyond choice or mercy. The Church called their endurance holy, but their silence was bought with pain. And when a husband died, the chains did not always fall away. Sometimes they only changed hands. Motherhood in the medieval world was a gift only in name, never in ownership. A woman could carry a child, endure the agony of birth, and nurture it through sleepless nights. Yet the law reminded her constantly that the child was not hers. Once born, the child belonged to the father's family, to the lineage that carried the man's name. The mother was merely a vessel, honoured in sentiment but erased in authority. When her husband died or left her, the bond between mother and child was severed as easily as cutting cloth. Her arms remained empty, but the world called it justice. The Church and the courts agreed that the father's blood determined a child's place in the world. When a man died, his heirs were assigned guardians, always male, never the woman who had raised them. These guardians could be uncles, cousins, or even distant relatives. They decided where the children lived, what they learned, and who they would marry. The mother's opinion meant nothing. She might plead for the right to stay near her children, but mercy was rare. A widow's grief was treated as weakness, her affection as instability. The same world that praised her for devotion doubted her reason the moment her husband's authority vanished. To lose a husband was to lose everything. Property, home, and children all shifted hands within days of his death. Officials recorded the transfer of guardianship like a transaction, listing names and inheritances. The widow's name appeared briefly, usually followed by the word without rights. She could be allowed to remain in the household as a caretaker, but even then, she lived under supervision. Her children became guests in her own home. It is almost cruelly ironic that the society which worshipped motherhood treated mothers as strangers once the father was gone. For women of the lower classes, the situation was even harsher. Peasant widows rarely had legal documents to prove their marriages or claim their children. Lords and local magistrates could assign the children to male relatives or even take them as labourers. A mother could not object. If she protested, she was accused of disobedience or madness. Her love had no standing before the law. Many women watched their children being carried away, knowing they would never see them again. Their grief was not recorded because grief was not considered a reason to speak. Among the nobility, the rules were cloaked in ceremony but were just as merciless. When a nobleman died, his sons were placed under the care of male tutors and advisors who trained them for inheritance. Daughters were sent to other noble households to be raised as future brides. The widow, even if she wished to educate or guide them, was rarely consulted. Her role was to mourn, not to mother. She wore black veils, attended masses for her husband's soul, and watched her children become pieces in political arrangements she could not control. If we compare it to today, it would be like losing both family and home simply because the law decided your love was less rational than blood. The church framed this as divine order. It taught that men represented strength and reason, while women embodied emotion and fragility. A child, it said, needed discipline more than affection. The mother's bond was acknowledged but not trusted. Sermons spoke of a woman's duty to accept God's will, even when that will took her children away. Her suffering was praised as a spiritual sacrifice, another test of faith to endure in silence. Many mothers tried to resist, using what little power they had. Some sought protection in convents, hoping the church would let them keep their children nearby. Others remarried quickly, not for love, but for leverage. A new husband could sometimes act as a bridge, restoring access to the children through male authority. But remarriage came at a price. The stepfather often became the new master of the household, replacing one form of control with another. In gaining her children, she lost her independence once more. The pain of separation was not only physical but also social. A woman without her children was pitied publicly and whispered about privately. Some accused her of neglect, others of divine punishment. Villagers avoided her, fearing that misfortune followed those whom God had judged. A mother's love, once sacred, became her shame. She was expected to bow her head, to thank God for testing her, and to go on with her chores as if motherhood could be washed away like dirt. There were moments when desperation broke the silence. A mother might try to flee with her children, hiding in distant towns or joining pilgrim groups under false names. When caught, she was punished severely, her children taken back by force. In the eyes of the church, her act was not love but rebellion, but her maternal instinct, the most natural of all, was criminalized. I think the most painful truth is not that the world took children from their mothers, but that it convinced those mothers to believe it was holy. For the children, the separation shaped their lives in quiet ways. They grew up believing their fathers' families were their only roots, their mothers mere memories. Daughters learned early that their own futures would follow the same pattern, that they would one day give birth to children who might also be taken from them. Sons, raised by men, inherited the same laws that had destroyed their mothers' hearts. Thus, the cycle of absence became tradition, passed down like an inheritance. Even when widows were allowed to stay near their children, the relationship changed. They were treated as caretakers, not parents, their affection seen as indulgence. A boy was told to obey his guardian above his mother, to prepare for manhood by rejecting softness. A girl was taught to imitate her mother's silence, to expect the same loss in her own time. The system succeeded not through force but through repetition. It made the unnatural seem inevitable. The church's version of compassion was to tell women that they would be reunited with their children in heaven. That promise became the only comfort left. Mothers prayed to saints who were themselves childless or male, searching for understanding where none existed. Their faith survived, but their hope dimmed. History rarely remembers their names, yet behind every noble house and peasant village stood the echo of a mother who was forced to let go. The loss did not end with individuals. It shaped entire generations of women who learned to love quietly, knowing that love offered no protection. They stitched clothes for children they no longer held, tended altars for sons and daughters buried in life. They survived by pretending that obedience was peace. In the medieval world, a mother's love was sacred but powerless, her children torn away by laws that worshipped bloodline over bond. Her arms were empty, her prayers unanswered, and her silence mistaken for faith. Yet beyond that grief, another terror waited, one that turned even purity into peril. Purity in the medieval world was not a virtue but a currency, and once it was lost, a woman lost everything. Her worth was measured not by her mind, her kindness, or her strength, but by a fragile idea sealed within her body. A single moment, a rumour, or an accusation could erase her entire existence. Whether she was innocent or violated, the world did not care. To men, Purity was proof of possession. To the church, it was proof of holiness. To women, it was a cage that could never be unlocked. From birth, girls were taught that their bodies were sacred only as long as they remained untouched. Mothers whispered warnings as they braided their daughters' hair, reminding them that one mistake could destroy a life. Priests reinforced the lesson in sermons, preaching that virginity was the truest form of virtue. A girl who stayed pure was promised honour in marriage and grace in heaven. A girl who did not was promised shame on earth and punishment in the afterlife. The rule was clear, the mercy absent. It is almost cruelly ironic that a society obsessed with purity made it impossible for women to remain innocent in their own stories. The burden of chastity defined every part of a woman's existence. She walked through the world as if through a field of traps, careful of every gesture, every word, every glance. A smile at the wrong man could spark suspicion. A torn sleeve could become proof of sin. And once gossip began, there was no way to stop it. Reputation was everything, and it could be destroyed faster than it could be defended. The truth didn't matter. Appearances ruled all. If a woman was raped, she was not seen as a victim. The crime was measured not by her suffering, but by how it affected the man who owned her, her father, her fiancé, or her husband. A violated woman brought dishonour to her family, even when she had fought to survive. Some were forced to marry their attackers to restore their respectability. Others were cast out entirely, left to wander or beg. To the law and the church, her body was not hers to protect or mourn. It was a property that had been spoiled. Among peasants, the consequences were brutal and immediate. A girl accused of immorality could be beaten, branded, or exiled from her village. Her family might deny her, fearing the stain of her shame. If she became pregnant, she was condemned twice, first for the act and again for bringing a child without a father. Many died in childbirth alone, hidden in barns or forests, their bodies buried quietly to erase the scandal. Even in death, they were unnamed. If we compare it to today, it would be like punishing someone for being the victim of a crime, and then erasing their existence as if it never happened. In noble families, purity was not just personal, it was political. A daughter's virginity was a family's reputation, a bargaining chip in alliances and dowries. Noble girls were guarded constantly, watched by maids, relatives, or priests. Their movements were restricted, their letters read, their friendships monitored. A whisper of impropriety could ruin entire households. Suitors withdrew, fortunes vanished, and alliances dissolved. The girl, often just a teenager, carried the weight of her family's future in the silence of her chastity. The church celebrated virginity as divine perfection. Saints and martyrs were praised for rejecting worldly desire. Their bodies were offered to God instead of men. But ordinary women had no such choice. They were expected to remain pure until marriage and fruitful afterward, a contradiction that defined their suffering. Virginity was worshipped until it was lost, then forgotten entirely. Once a woman became a wife, her purity no longer mattered, only her obedience did, and if she lost it outside of marriage, her very humanity was questioned. Confession offered no refuge. Priests heard women's secrets not to absolve but to remind them of guilt. A girl who confessed to impure thoughts might be punished as harshly as one who acted upon them. The church blurred the line between thought and sin, ensuring that even innocence was tinged with fear. It was a system designed to control the mind through the body, and the body through shame. The double standard was absolute. Men's transgressions were treated as youthful folly, forgiven easily with prayer or payment. Women's mistakes were eternal. The same men who sought purity in their brides sought pleasure elsewhere without consequence. The hypocrisy was so ingrained that few questioned it. Women were taught to accept their suffering as justice, to see their punishment as deserved. I think the most haunting part is not that women were destroyed for losing purity. but that they were made to believe they deserved it. Even the concept of redemption was cruel. A fallen woman could only reclaim her dignity by disappearing, joining a convent, serving in silence, or dying in repentance. Stories and ballads romanticized these sacrifices, calling them holy transformations. But behind the poetry was despair. A life reduced to prayer and confinement was not salvation. It was erasure disguised as virtue. Pregnancy outside marriage sealed a woman's fate. Her belly became evidence, undeniable and public. Communities reacted with outrage, treating her as a moral infection. Some were executed, others were cast out into poverty, forced to abandon or sell their children. There are records of women drowning themselves in rivers, believing that death would wash away their shame. Their tragedies were not anomalies, they were traditions. Even women who lived blameless lives were haunted by fear. Every mother warned her daughter not to trust, not to speak, not to hope too freely. Virginity became both armor and prison. It promised safety but demanded silence. It was not about purity of heart, but control of body. Through it, the church and society maintained order, one woman at a time. The cruelest part was how deeply the idea of purity shaped identity. It convinced women that their worth could be measured by something that could be taken without their consent. It turned survival into sin and desire into damnation. The legacy of that thinking lingers far beyond the medieval walls, echoing in cultures that still tie honour to control over women's bodies. For medieval women, purity was a trap disguised as virtue, a weight that no one could carry without breaking. Their worth vanished the moment suspicion touched them, their lives rewritten by shame. And after their innocence was gone, another cruelty awaited. Their bodies would become tools in a larger game of power and politics. Power in the medieval world was built on bloodlines, and women were the veins through which that power flowed. Their marriages were not unions of choice, but instruments of strategy. A noble girl could be promised to a man she had never met, in a land she had never seen, because her body carried the weight of alliance, to kings, lords, and knights. She was not a person but a seal upon a treaty, a tool for peace, or a weapon in disguise. The moment she was born, her future was mapped in ink, her life traded for influence. Among the nobility, daughters were raised not for themselves but for the ambitions of men. They were taught languages to charm foreign courts, music to please suitors, and silence to endure whatever bargain was struck in their name. The father negotiated, the priest blessed, and the daughter obeyed. Her tears were seen as weakness, her reluctance as disobedience. Once she left her home, she belonged to another family, another cause. Her happiness was a price no one counted. It is strikingly cruel that in a world obsessed with honour, no one saw dishonour in turning women into currency. Marriage among the powerful was rarely about affection. It was a trade of land, titles, and alliances. A bride's body symbolized peace between rivals, and her womb was expected to secure it. She carried heirs that belonged not to her, but to the lineage of her husband. Her worth was renewed only by childbirth, and her failure to conceive could dissolve entire alliances. A barren woman was more dangerous than a broken treaty. She could be replaced easily, sent away quietly, accused of sin, or confined to a convent to make room for another bride. Even outside the noble courts, war made women victims of invisible politics. When armies marched, villages burned, and the first to suffer were always the women. Soldiers treated them as spoils, proof of conquest. After battles, the streets filled with stories no one dared to tell aloud. Mothers hid daughters in barns or forests, hoping survival would not be seen as defiance. The destruction of a city was marked not only by its fallen walls, but by the women left behind. Their bodies became the battlefield that history refused to name. For queens and princesses, privilege offered no protection. Many were sent abroad as peace offerings, married to foreign rulers who saw them as symbols, not partners. Their letters home spoke of loneliness, fear, and silence. They lived among strangers, surrounded by courtiers who measured every move, every word. Their children were heirs of foreign thrones, bound to lands that might one day turn against their mother's blood. Even the highest crown could not shield them from the reality that they were never more than pieces in a larger game. If we compare it to today, it would be like signing a peace treaty with your own life as the signature. When war broke out, women of all ranks were swept into chaos. Some became widows overnight, others captives dragged across continents. The victors claimed their bodies as trophies. The losers buried their shame in silence. There was no law to protect them, only prayers spoken too late. The church preached forgiveness, urging women to accept their fate as part of divine will. The conquerors called their acts victory. The priests called it trial, and the women had no word for it at all. Political manipulation extended beyond marriage and war. Daughters were used to secure alliances, mothers to preserve them, and widows to strengthen claims. A single woman could shift the balance of kingdoms. Her name could start a rebellion or end one. Yet in the end, she held no power over her destiny. History remembers their names attached to men's achievements. Eleanor, Isabella, Margaret, figures described by beauty, fertility, or scandal, never by choice. Behind each was a lifetime of sacrifice woven into silence. In many cases, the cruelty was not in the act but in the expectation. Women were praised for their endurance, for smiling through loss, for carrying honour like a wound that never healed. Songs were written about their faithfulness, their gentle acceptance of suffering. The poets called it grace, the church called it virtue. But beneath the hymns and legends was a truth no one sang. Endurance was not glory, it was survival. And survival came at the cost of everything they were. Those who tried to resist were quickly erased. A queen who questioned her husband's decisions could be accused of treason. A noble woman who refused an arranged marriage risked imprisonment. Some fled to monasteries, hoping for safety and devotion. Yet even there, politics reached through the walls. The church often used nuns as pawns too, writing alliances through religious vows instead of wedding contracts. There was no sanctuary from the hands of men who treated women as tools of order. The wars that defined medieval Europe were written in chronicles that celebrated generals and kings. But between the lines lay the untold stories of women who endured in silence. They tended to the wounded, buried the dead, and rebuilt homes reduced to ash. They were the invisible spine of every broken country, holding families together while men claimed glory for tearing them apart. I think what makes their suffering most haunting is how easily history praised their obedience while forgetting their pain. Even when peace returned, the cycle continued. Treaties demanded new marriages, new exchanges, new sacrifices. Girls born in the ashes of one war were raised to prevent another, only to suffer the same fate when peace broke again. Generations of women became collateral in men's ambitions, their bodies carrying both the promise and the punishment of power. In paintings and chronicles, these women appear graceful and silent, draped in jewels or veils. The world remembers them as symbols of devotion and loyalty, but their true legacy is one of endurance through horror. Their quiet suffering built kingdoms that celebrated victory, but never acknowledged the cost. For medieval women, politics and war were cages without walls. Their lives were traded to build peace, their bodies conquered to prove victory, their grief rewritten as duty. And when the fighting ended, the silence that followed birthed a new kind of prison, one that waited behind the locked doors of their own chambers. Privacy, to a medieval woman, was an impossible dream. Her life was lived beneath constant eyes, her body and behaviour guarded as though they belonged to someone else. Even the bedroom, that last imagined refuge, was never hers. Curtains could be drawn, doors could be shut, But walls had ears, and servants stood nearby, for noble women especially. Every moment was observed, measured, and judged. Modesty was not protection. It was surveillance turned into virtue. A woman's purity was considered too valuable to be left unattended, and so she was never alone. In castles and manors, the idea of personal space did not exist. Rooms were shared, beds were shared, and servants moved freely between chambers at all hours. A lady's morning began not with peace but with intrusion, maids entering to dress her, attendants waiting to lace her bodice, pages delivering letters. Even in her sleep, she was rarely unseen. Handmaidens kept watch, sometimes sleeping near the bed to ensure no unapproved visitor could approach. Privacy was seen as anger, solitude, as sin. It is almost laughable that a society so obsessed with chastity ensured women could never experience it without an audience. The same scrutiny followed her into every act. Dressing, bathing, and even prayer were public performances disguised as routines. Baths were prepared in open rooms, sometimes before family members or guests. To bathe alone was suspicious. A woman's body was a matter of honour, and honour required witnesses. Servants poured the water, washed her hair, and stood nearby as she dried. Her comfort was secondary to the assurance that she remained virtuous. The human need for modesty was redefined as temptation, and the only cure for temptation was supervision. For young noble women, the surveillance began early. Daughters of wealthy families were watched constantly by governesses and attendants, instructed never to lock doors or linger alone. At court, their every movement was catalogued by gossip. If a servant reported an unguarded moment, the consequence could be severe: a lost engagement, a ruined reputation, or worse. A nobleman's daughter lived under the illusion of luxury, surrounded by silk and gold, but stripped of the smallest freedoms. If we compare it to today, it would be like living in a palace without walls, where even breathing alone is considered rebellion. The reason for such control was fear of scandal, fear of rumour, fear of desire. Men believed that a woman's morality depended entirely on confinement. Her virtue was proof of her family's reputation, and so they built invisible cages around her. Fathers hired guards to patrol hallways, and husbands demanded that servants report any sign of impropriety. Even within marriage, a woman's body was never private. Her husband had the right to enter her chamber whenever he pleased, his authority reinforced by both law and religion. Consent was not part of the marriage vow. Obedience was. Servants who surrounded noblewomen acted both as helpers and spies. They dressed, fed, and accompanied their mistresses, but they also reported everything they saw. A careless word could reach the ears of a husband or priest by nightfall. Women learned quickly that trust was dangerous. They smiled, they thanked, but they never spoke freely. The same hand that held a comb in the morning might carry a rumour by evening. To survive such a life, one had to master the art of stillness, speaking softly, moving gracefully, and revealing nothing. The Church reinforced this system with divine justification. Priests preached that modesty was proof of faith, and isolation invited sin. Solitude was described as a temptation of the devil. Women were told that constant company kept them pure, that their souls were safest under watchful eyes. Confession, too, became a tool of surveillance. What a woman whispered to her confessor could shape how she was treated at home. A careless admission could turn into a lifelong restriction. The spiritual cage mirrored the physical one. Even queens, surrounded by attendants and power, lived under the same conditions. Their chambers were never empty. Pages guarded doors. Ladies in waiting managed schedules, and priests oversaw morality. Every letter sent, every gift received, passed through someone else's hands. A queen who closed her door too often risked suspicion. Rumours could unravel kingdoms. and so she learned to exist within a circle of observation. Her own face in the mirror was the only one that would not judge her. Among the lower classes, the lack of privacy was born of necessity rather than control. Peasants lived in single-room huts where families shared space with animals. There was no door to close, no secret to keep. A woman gave birth, bathed, and slept in the same room where her children played and her husband worked. Intimacy was public by circumstance. Yet even here, she was not free from scrutiny. The village watched as much as the castle did, and any deviation from custom drew suspicion. Privacy was not a right of class, but a privilege no one truly possessed. For some women, the only time they were truly alone was in prayer. Churches offered brief moments of quiet, though even then, others' eyes followed them. Solitude became a luxury of imagination, a memory from before marriage, or a dream that could never be fulfilled. Some found solace in gardens, walking at dawn or dusk when servants slept. But even the wind carried whispers, and any absence too long became reason for questions. This constant intrusion shaped how women thought and lived. They learned to fold themselves inward, to guard their expressions, to speak carefully. Desire, curiosity, even grief had to be hidden beneath layers of control. The body became something to endure rather than inhabit. To be visible was a risk. To be private was impossible. The world left no space between those two truths. I think the greatest cruelty was not that they were watched, but that they were convinced this watchfulness was love. Over time, this lack of privacy became internalized. Women began to monitor themselves even when no one was present. Their conscience became the invisible guard, whispering the rules that society had written into their bones. Generations later, this inherited vigilance would still linger, in posture, in silence, in the instinct to seek permission before existing fully. The bedroom, the bath, the chapel, none belonged to them. The world carved away the boundaries that defined selfhood until women were left exposed to both judgment and expectation. To live constantly observed was to live without peace, and yet this was the standard by which virtue was measured. For medieval women, solitude was sin, and silence was survival. Their every breath belonged to witnesses, their privacy dissolved beneath duty and fear. But even within those guarded walls, another injustice waited, one that reached beyond the living and took even their children from their arms. A woman's body in the medieval world was never her own. From the moment she reached womanhood, it belonged to others, to her father, her husband, her confessor, and her God. Every decision about her health, her fertility, and her flesh was made by someone else. Her body was a tool of duty, meant to serve the family, the church, or the state. It existed to bear children, to endure, and to obey. Pain was not seen as suffering, but as proof of virtue. The more she endured, the holier she was said to be. The more she submitted, the more her worth was affirmed. Marriage sealed this captivity completely. A wife had no right to refuse her husband's will, no matter the state of her health. The church declared that the marriage bed was sacred, and within it, a woman's consent was eternal. Her body was a debt she could never repay, her submission an act of devotion. If she turned away, she was told it was a sin. Priests urged wives to be obedient in all things, reminding them that denial was rebellion against God's order. The idea of choice simply did not exist. It is almost unbearable to imagine a world where faith was used to sanctify the absence of consent. For noble women, the intrusion went further. Their fertility was a matter of politics. Heirs secured alliances, and childbearing was the proof of loyalty. Physicians and priests prescribed tonics, elixirs, and prayers to increase conception. Many of these remedies contained toxic herbs, metals, or animal extracts that poisoned rather than healed. Some women swallowed them obediently, their bodies weakening as they struggled to conceive again and again. To fail in childbirth was not a misfortune, it was failure of purpose, even when their bodies begged for rest. They were told to continue, to try again, for the good of the family name. Among common women, childbirth itself was a battlefield. There were no doctors for them, only midwives who relied on knowledge passed by word of mouth. If a labour went wrong, the mother was left to fate. Yet even as she fought for her life, her choices were dismissed. Priests stood outside homes to administer last rites rather than assistance. The outcome of birth was seen as divine will, not human responsibility. When women died, it was said that God had called them for a reason. Their deaths were described as holy, their pain as necessary. If we compare it to today, it would be like calling neglect mercy and suffering a form of faith. Pregnancy, for most, was a cycle of fear. Each one carried the risk of death, yet women had no say in how often it happened. They could be pregnant for most of their adult lives, their bodies weakened and scarred, their spirits slowly fading. Rest was considered indulgence, and refusal was rebellion. A woman might miscarry from exhaustion and be forced back to work the next day. Some were made to drink potions believed to restore fertility, though the mixtures often caused lasting harm. The body was treated not as living flesh but as a vessel of divine obligation. Even in illness, a woman's autonomy was denied. A wife could not refuse her husband's demands even when she was feverish or in pain. Her suffering was invisible, absorbed into expectation. The church forbade her from using certain herbs or remedies that might ease pain, claiming they interfered with God's plan. Healing was permitted only through prayer, confession, or endurance. To seek control over her own body was seen as vanity, a sin of pride against divine design. Midwives, who understood the rhythms of the female body better than any priest or scholar, were both relied upon and feared. Their knowledge gave them power, and power drew suspicion. The church accused many of witchcraft, claiming they meddled with creation. Those who offered herbs to ease childbirth or prevent conception risked torture or death. What had once been women helping women became another crime in a world ruled by fear of female agency. The right to understand one's own body was turned into blasphemy. The contradiction was everywhere. The same society that expected women to produce children forbade them from making any decision about when or how. The same priests who condemned abortion ignored the deaths caused by endless pregnancies. Women were reduced to bodies that served purposes larger than themselves. Their health was sacrificed to faith, their identity to obedience. There was no distinction between body and soul. Both were possessions of others. Even noble women, surrounded by physicians and wealth, suffered the same fate. Their pregnancies were public events, their diets controlled, their rest supervised. Servants reported every change in appetite or mood. When labour came, their chambers filled with attendants, not for comfort but for witness. Every scream was heard, every movement observed. Their privacy was gone, even in agony. The birth of a son brought celebration, the birth of a daughter brought silence. Survival was an afterthought. Some women tried to reclaim fragments of control. A few learned to use herbs secretly, passing recipes through whispers and coded prayers. These acts of defiance were dangerous but deeply human, a small rebellion against the system that demanded their submission. Others prayed for sterility, believing that divine punishment might also be divine protection. Desperation turned into faith because it was the only form of resistance allowed. I think what lingers most painfully is how they were made to thank God for the pain others inflicted upon them. The weight of this powerlessness did not end with childbirth. Even after bearing children, women's bodies remained subject to judgment. Their recovery time was dictated by priests, who declared when they were clean enough to return to the church and their husbands' beds. There was no recognition of trauma, no understanding of rest. The female body was both worshipped and controlled, venerated and violated in the same breath. Over generations, this denial of autonomy became so normalized that many women believed it was divine truth. They apologized for exhaustion, for illness, for pain, as though each weakness was proof of sin. The church called it humility. Society called it grace. But beneath those words was something far simpler fear. A woman who believed she had no right to her body could never challenge those who claimed ownership over it. Freedom, for medieval women, did not mean wealth or power. It meant the right to decide when to breathe, to rest, to heal. Yet even that most basic freedom was denied. Their bodies became monuments to endurance, their suffering proof of devotion, their silence mistaken for virtue. The idea that a woman might own her own body was so foreign that it bordered on heresy. In the medieval world, a woman's body was not her temple but her prison, its walls built by faith and law. Every choice was made for her, every breath supervised, every pain sanctified, and even when she looked beyond her own suffering, she found no ally, only laws that silenced her voice before it ever reached the court. Justice in the medieval world was a language women were never taught to speak. Courts, judges, and laws existed all around them, but none of them belonged to them. A woman could be accused, punished, or condemned, yet rarely allowed to defend herself. Her words meant nothing unless a man repeated them. The world decided that truth required a masculine voice. That reason could not exist in the minds of women. In the eyes of the law, she was not a full person, but a reflection of male authority, seen only when he permitted it. The courtroom was not a place of fairness, but of hierarchy. Men filled every role: the judge, the clerks, the witnesses, the priests. When a woman stood before them, she entered not as a citizen but as an interruption. If she spoke too firmly, she was disrespectful. If she wept, she was dismissed as emotional. The very act of defending herself became proof of her guilt. It is almost absurd that a system claiming to serve God's justice refused to hear half of God's creation. To testify, a woman needed a man's confirmation. Her word alone held no weight. Even when she was the victim, her story required validation from those who often benefited from her silence. In cases of assault or theft, she needed witnesses, male ones, to verify her claim. Without them, the court assumed deceit. Women learned quickly that the law did not exist to protect them, only to measure their obedience. Their pain, no matter how visible, was never enough. Punishment reflected this same cruelty. For the same crimes, women faced harsher sentences than men. Theft by a man could mean a fine. Theft by a woman could mean mutilation or death. Adultery for a man was a sin to confess. For a woman, it was a stain that justified execution. The double standard was carved into the foundation of law itself. The church called it moral order, but it was control disguised as faith. If we compare it to today, it would be like standing before a judge who has already decided you are guilty simply because of your gender. Even when women sought to defend others, their voices were dismissed. Mothers who testified for their sons, wives who swore their husbands innocent, daughters who begged for fairness, all were silenced with the same reasoning. Women were ruled by emotion, not logic. Priests wrote that women were closer to sin, more easily deceived by the devil. The law adopted this belief as fact. Rationality was declared masculine, and justice followed the same rule. For noble women, privilege provided little comfort. Though they could afford representation, their defenders were always men, lawyers, stewards, or clerics. Their cases were argued in voices not their own, their pleas rewritten to sound more acceptable to male ears. Many were instructed to stay quiet in court, their mere presence considered sufficient submission. Some were even told that silence would help their cause, as if the absence of their words could make them seem more virtuous. Their fate depended entirely on how convincingly others could translate their suffering into something the court would find tolerable. Among common women, the injustice was blunter. They could not afford counsel or influence. Their disputes, over wages, property, or abuse, rarely reached the court at all. Local lords settled matters privately, often siding with male employers or relatives. If a husband beat his wife, it was deemed a family affair. If she fought back, it became a crime. Her testimony was irrelevant, her guilt presumed. Many women stopped trying altogether. Silence became the only defense left. Religion reinforced every layer of this structure. The church taught that women's emotions clouded judgment, that Eve's original sin had tainted their reason. Preachers compared women's voices to wind, loud but without direction. Sermons urged men to guide and interpret their wives' words, as though women could not be trusted even with their own truths. This belief seeped into every corner of society until it became self-fulfilling. Women stopped speaking because no one listened, and men claimed that silence proved inferiority. There were rare exceptions, widows or noblewomen who managed estates in their husband's absence. These women sometimes appeared in court, but only to protect property, not principle. Even then, their authority was questioned. They needed written permission from deceased or absent husbands, as if their competence expired without male supervision. The law didn't care whether they were intelligent or capable. It cared only that they had once belonged to a man. Some women tried to find justice outside the courtroom. They appealed to monasteries, confessed to priests, or sought help from travelling judges. But these efforts often ended in humiliation. Confession turned into interrogation. Compassion turned into moral lectures. The priest might promise prayer, but prayer was not protection. There were no laws against disbelief, and disbelief was all they received. In cases of sexual violence, the cruelty reached its peak. For a woman to accuse a man of assault was to risk ruin. Without witnesses, her claim was dismissed. If she were poor, she was accused of lying for money. If she were noble, she was accused of disgracing her family. And if she were proven unreliable, she could face punishment for defamation. The result was silence so deep that entire generations grew up believing such crimes were rare. The truth was simply never recorded. I think the most horrifying part is that injustice did not hide behind secrecy. It wore the face of law itself. Men of the church wrote treatises claiming that women's suffering purified society. To them, submission was not oppression, but divine order. Even when women begged for fairness, they were told to accept their place and trust in God's will. The church turned its obedience into theology, and the courts turned theology into law. Together, they made injustice eternal. Over time, women's exclusion from justice became so ingrained that it shaped language itself. Words like witness, citizen, and jury referred only to men. Even the concept of truth was bound to masculinity. Women existed on the margins of legality, visible enough to be punished, invisible when they sought protection. Their voices echoed in court records only through the writings of those who ignored them. To live in such a world was to understand that fairness was a privilege, not a right. Women learned to endure quietly, to hope for mercy rather than justice. They prayed not to be right, but to be believed, and when the world refused them even that, they turned to silence as their final form of dignity. Medieval women faced a justice system that silenced them before they even spoke. Their truth could only exist through men's mouths, their pain translated into doubt. And when the courts closed their ears, another kind of trial began, the quiet suffering inside homes where justice never entered at all. When a husband died in the medieval world, the women left behind did not inherit freedom. They inherited emptiness, debt, and suspicion. Widowhood was not seen as survival, but as failure, as if women without men existed only halfway. In the eyes of society, they were neither maidens nor wives, bodies without purpose and names without protection. The church called their condition pious, but beneath the surface of holy resignation lay quiet despair. The first blow came with the law. Unless they had sons old enough to inherit, everything their husbands owned, the land, the animals, the tools, even the clothes in the chest, passed to male relatives. The widows might be allowed to remain in the home for a few weeks, but they could be evicted at any time. Their possessions were divided under the pretense of fairness, yet fairness never included them. They became guests in their own lives, forced to rely on the pity of others. It is grimly ironic that the death of a husband was treated not as a tragedy, but as a legal opportunity for men to reclaim control. The church's rules were no kinder. Widows could not remarry without the permission of their husband's family, and in many cases, that permission never came. Families feared losing dowries or property if they remarried, so they denied them the choice altogether. Some were sent to convents, not from devotion, but to keep inheritance intact. Others were confined to widow houses, where they lived among other discarded women. These places were cold, silent, and poor. They were not sanctuaries, but holding pens for those who had outlived their usefulness. Among the wealthy, the same cruelty wore finer clothes. Noble widows were surrounded by servants and silks, but every decision about their lives was made by male relatives. If they wished to manage their late husband's estate, they had to petition the crown. If they refused to remarry strategically, their lands could be seized. Even queens were not free from this rule. Royal widows were expected to act as symbols of grief and obedience, wearing black for years and avoiding public joy. A woman's sorrow was measured not by love but by compliance. The poorer widows faced a harsher world still. Without dowries or family support, many drifted into destitution. They spun wool, sold herbs, or begged outside churches. Villages viewed them with suspicion, whispering that their misfortune was punishment for sin. Some accused them of witchcraft, believing their survival without men was unnatural. Others mocked them for being burdens, women who consumed without producing. If we compare it to today, it would be like losing a spouse and being told that grief itself was proof of failure. The isolation was not only physical but spiritual. The church preached that a widow's duty was prayer and restraint. Their mourning was to last indefinitely, their joy never to return. If they showed signs of laughter or interest in life, they were condemned as indecent. Priests told them that their only path to redemption was through repentance for pleasures once known. Even their clothing became cages, dark fabric, coarse texture, modesty that erased their shapes. To be seen was to invite gossip, to smile was to sin. Many struggled to feed themselves. In towns, they might rent small rooms in the poorest districts, surviving on bread and broth. Some took in laundry or worked as servants, enduring humiliation to stay alive. Others relied on charity from monasteries, but charity came with shame. They had to kneel, confess, and thank men who saw them as sinners. Hunger became familiar, cold, a daily companion. Still, society praised them for humility, as though starvation were a virtue. A few tried to rebuild their lives. Some remarried in secret or fled to distant towns where no one knew their names. But if discovered, they faced punishment from both the church and the family. Their new marriages could be annulled, their children declared illegitimate. Freedom always came at the cost of reputation. To live independently was to risk being erased altogether. Even in their quiet grief, they remained useful to others. The church used its stories as moral lessons, praising submission and warning against desire. Artists painted them as saints or sinners, never as human beings. Their tears were turned into symbols of purity, their silence into proof of faith. Yet behind every pious image were women who still hungered, who still remembered warmth, who still longed to be seen. I often think the cruelest part of their suffering was how society turned their pain into decoration. The laws that governed inheritance and marriage ensured that widowhood was never liberation. It was another form of captivity, just without the pretense of affection. Even when they managed to keep a small piece of land, they were surrounded by men eager to claim it. The courts rarely sided with them. The church reminded them to be patient, and time, slow and merciless, eroded what little dignity they had left. In some cases, widows formed small communities of their own, They shared bread, candles, and warmth in cramped cottages, caring for one another in ways society never would. These fragile networks were acts of quiet rebellion, built from the understanding that no one else would save them. Their lives were marked by endurance rather than hope. But within that endurance lay something deeply human, a refusal to disappear entirely. Generations of women lived and died in this cycle, their stories buried beneath the names of their husbands. They were never remembered as individuals, only as extensions of someone else's legacy. Their grief became a public ritual, their love rewritten as duty, and so the widows remained the most invisible of all women, present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. In the medieval world, widowhood was not freedom gained, but chains rearranged. The women left behind became both burden and warning, praised for obedience yet punished for survival. And beyond their silence, another kind of loneliness waited, the cruel judgment of those who believed their suffering was never enough. In the medieval world, women were not born into weakness, but they were taught to believe in it. From the moment they could understand words, the lessons began humility, obedience, silence. Every prayer, every sermon, every rule of conduct reminded them that reason belonged to men and emotion belonged to women. This belief was so deeply woven into society that even women repeated it among themselves, teaching their daughters that to survive was to stay small. It is tragically amusing that a civilization which praised divine order managed to confuse submission with virtue. Moral guides, written mostly by priests and scholars, spoke with absolute certainty. They said women were easily led astray by their passions, incapable of independent judgment, and in constant need of male guidance. The pages were filled with instructions how to walk, how to speak, how to serve. A woman who raised her voice was described as dangerous, her will compared to the temptation of Eve. Knowledge was treated as poison in her hands, ambition as corruption of the soul. Even noble women, surrounded by books and tutors, were warned not to think too much. The act of questioning itself was a sin against nature. In homes and villages, these ideas became rules of daily life. A girl learned to keep her eyes low when speaking, to bow when entering a room, and to never contradict a man, even if he was wrong. Every gesture was a rehearsal for obedience. When she married, the lessons continued, now enforced by a husband who claimed divine authority over her body and soul. The church supported this hierarchy, declaring that man was the head and woman the heart, and that the heart must always obey. What was called balance was simply control written in holy ink. The fear of women's independence ran deep. When one spoke too intelligently, people whispered. When she expressed anger, they called it madness. When she acted with confidence, they said she wanted to be a man. Entire communities worked together to keep women in their place, not out of cruelty but out of habit. It was easier to preserve the illusion of male strength than to admit that the difference was only invented. If we saw it through modern eyes, it would be like punishing someone for breathing too loudly just because the air was said to belong to someone else. The result was a quiet kind of imprisonment. Women learned to hide their opinions, to fold their desires beneath layers of politeness. Even when they knew more, they pretended ignorance. It was a survival skill, a language of silence passed down through generations. The world admired them for their patience, yet that patience was the product of fear. Their calm was not natural but learned, shaped by the understanding that rebellion meant isolation or worse. For men, control was both duty and right. Fathers guided their daughters, husbands corrected their wives, and priests instructed them all. Every moment of a woman's life was surrounded by supervision. A lone woman was considered suspicious, a potential source of temptation or disorder. She could not travel alone, speak in council, or make a decision that affected her household without approval. Even charity, when done by women, required permission. The idea that she might act from reason rather than emotion was too radical to be believed. The church reinforced this system through scripture and example. Eve's sin became the template for all female behaviour, proof that women were born with weakness in their hearts. Saints who were women were admired only for their suffering, never for their intelligence. They were praised for enduring pain quietly, for sacrificing ambition, for existing in the background of holiness. Their reward was remembrance in silence, their names spoken only to remind others how to behave. In villages, mothers taught daughters to endure the same limitations they had lived through. They warned them not to speak too much, not to draw attention, and not to show confidence. Each generation folded itself smaller, shaping a pattern of quiet that was mistaken for gentleness. A woman who tried to break that cycle risked losing everything: her safety, her reputation, even her faith. In a world where men's words were law, a woman's thought was rebellion. Still, even within that silence, some women found ways to resist. They used cleverness disguised as humility, kindness turned into persuasion. They learned to guide men's decisions without appearing to lead. In the shadows of control, they built small spaces of power, tending to homes, managing households, influencing families through quiet persistence. Their strength did not roar, it endured. There is something deeply human in how women built dignity from obedience, finding control within the cage itself, but the illusion of fragility never disappeared. Paintings, songs, and stories celebrated the image of the delicate woman, graceful but helpless. Her beauty was her weapon, her silence her virtue. It was easier for men to love a symbol than a person, so women became symbols of purity, of devotion, of everything men wanted to protect and therefore possess. In the end, the myth of weakness became a comfort to everyone but the women who lived under it. Generations later, those teachings still lingered, buried in culture and custom. The belief that a woman needed guidance survived longer than the empires that enforced it. It shaped laws, literature, and even love. It turned humanity into hierarchy, faith into fear. The tragedy of it all is that the world mistook control for care, obedience for peace, and silence for wisdom. And the women who saw through the lie had no one to tell it to. In the medieval mind, weakness was not an accident, but a design. Women were trained to obey and praised when they forgot to want more. Yet beyond the prayers and lessons, a quiet question remained: what would happen if they stopped believing they were fragile? In the medieval home, the sound of violence was not considered a crime. It was considered a private matter. A woman's bruises were invisible to the law, her cries absorbed by stone walls and silence. The church preached harmony within families, yet its version of harmony meant endurance. When a husband struck his wife, it was called correction, not cruelty. When she hid her pain, it was called virtue. The world expected her to suffer quietly, believing that obedience could heal what mercy refused to see. It is bitterly absurd that faith demanded forgiveness before it demanded protection. There were no shelters, no safe doors waiting in the night. The home itself, where she was supposed to be safest, was the source of fear. Neighbours might hear the violence but would not interfere. To do so would mean questioning a man's authority, and that was considered far worse than any act he committed behind closed doors. The few who dared to speak up were told it was not their place. The boundaries of privacy became a shield for cruelty, a law enforced by silence. Legal systems reflected the same logic. A man could strike his wife as long as he did not kill her. He could control her money, her body, her time, and still be praised as a good husband. The church taught that patience was a woman's duty, that her suffering mirrored the holy endurance of saints. If she ran away, she was labelled disobedient and sinful. If she fought back, she was called mad. The same hand that hurt her could drag her to confession, where priests reminded her to forgive. The bruises were proof of her failure to please, not his failure to love. For poor women, escape was unthinkable. They had nowhere to go, no money to live, no name apart from their husbands. The village might whisper about her condition, but would blame her for it, claiming she provoked the violence. Food and shelter were more important than dignity, so she returned to the same walls every night, knowing exactly what awaited. If we look at it in modern terms, it would be like living in a world where every law protected the attacker and every prayer asked the victim to apologize. In richer households, the cruelty wore finer clothes. A noble woman might be beaten in silence by a man who called himself honourable. Servants would look away, pretending not to hear. Her pain would be hidden beneath lace sleeves and polite smiles at court. Even queens were not exempt. Chronicles rarely spoke of it, but their marriages, too, were cages of expectation. Royal blood did not make the blows softer, it only made the silence more expensive. The church and the court shared a single belief that a husband's authority was sacred. To challenge it was to challenge the order of God. Laws were written by men who could not imagine themselves on the other side of the fist. The word domestic became an excuse, a boundary no one could cross. The idea that cruelty could exist inside marriage was dismissed as absurd, because marriage itself was supposed to sanctify all that happened within it. The home was treated like a fortress, where the screams of women faded before reaching the outside world. Mothers who lived through such violence taught their daughters endurance, not resistance. They said it was better to keep quiet, better to pray, better to wait for anger to pass. Each generation inherited the silence of the one before it. It became tradition disguised as wisdom. Girls learned to keep peace at any cost, to cook and serve with trembling hands, to hide marks beneath long sleeves. They were told that their patience could change men, as if suffering were a kind of magic that transformed cruelty into care. Some women tried to fight back, though history rarely remembered them. Some fled and lived as beggars, surviving on scraps rather than returning home. Others were captured and punished, accused of abandoning duty. There were even those who were executed, not for violence but for refusing to endure it. Their names disappeared from records, replaced by the word wicked. It is haunting to think that a woman could be punished more harshly for running than a man for hitting. Inside the walls of villages, violence was normalized in small ways. Men laughed about their tempers in taverns, and priests counseled wives to be better wives when complaints arose. Society saw bruises as lessons. A swollen face meant disobedience corrected. A broken rib meant a marriage maintained. The cruelty was not seen as evil, but as order restored. Even in moments of peace, fear lingered like a shadow that never lifted. Some women sought comfort in faith, lighting candles for deliverance that never came. They prayed for their husbands to change, for their sons not to grow up the same. The church offered blessings and words about virtue, but never a refuge. Mercy was promised in heaven, not on earth. And so they endured, their prayers becoming lullabies for survival, whispered to themselves in the dark. In time, this quiet suffering became a cultural truth. A woman who endured violence without complaint was admired. Songs praised her patience, and stories used her as a model of moral strength. Even the language of love carried the echo of control, where gentleness meant obedience and loyalty meant silence. To be good was to be still was to survive. Centuries later, the idea still lingers like dust that refuses to settle. The belief that pain must be endured rather than confronted has deep roots. It is the legacy of countless women whose suffering was treated as invisible. They were not weak. They were trapped inside a world that mistook cruelty for order and submission for peace. In the medieval home, violence was not a secret but a custom. Women learned to breathe quietly through pain, to find strength in fear, to survive within the walls that betrayed them, and in that stillness, another kind of silence began to form, the silence that comes before rebellion. In the medieval world, a woman's life was often decided long before she could speak for herself. Every rule, every sermon, Every whisper around the hearth told her what she was meant to be and what she must never become. From birth to death, obedience was her protection, silence her duty, and endurance her only virtue. But when the world closed every path except submission, some women found one final escape that no man could take away. In death, they claimed a freedom that life had refused to give. It is chilling that for many women, peace began only when breath ended. To understand this, one must imagine a society where despair was not rare but routine. Marriage could be a sentence, childbirth a risk, and faith a constant reminder of sin. For those who suffered endlessly, death was not rebellion, it was release. Many took their own lives quietly, slipping into rivers or swallowing herbs that promised sleep. The church condemned suicide as sin, yet still preached that heaven awaited the pure and penitent. Between those contradictions, some women decided that their only way to reach salvation was to leave the world behind. Records speak of women who drowned themselves rather than be forced into marriages arranged for political gain. Others leapt from towers to escape men who claimed them as property. Chronicles describe these deaths as tragedies, yet the tone is often cold, as though the scribes writing them believed the women had merely misunderstood their place. The truth was harsher. In a world where a woman's no had no value, death became the only statement that could not be silenced. The same contradiction lived within religion. The church told women to value purity above life itself. Virginity was holiness, and any loss of it, even through violence, was seen as moral failure. Some girls, cornered by attackers or forced into unwanted marriages, chose death to protect what society called their virtue. Martyrdom was glorified, so long as it happened in the name of faith rather than resistance. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like teaching someone that their worth exists only as long as they are untouched, and then blaming them when the world refuses to keep its hands off. Some deaths were not chosen, but imposed. A woman accused of sin or witchcraft might be burned alive for the good of her soul. The flames were called purifying, the screams divine music. These public executions were framed as sacrifice, as if pain could be sanctified through spectacle. Families often stood by in silence, told that their loved one's death was an act of redemption. The church wrapped horror in holiness, and the crowd accepted it as moral theatre. In that light, murder became worship. Not every act of death was visible. Some women simply faded away. Starvation, neglect, and grief were slow weapons, as effective as fire. Widows left in cold rooms, wives beaten until their bodies failed, mothers who watched their children die, all carried despair that hollowed them from within. Their deaths were recorded as illness, not choice, though the line between the two blurred easily. Even in dying, they were denied the dignity of acknowledgement. Their silence continued to serve the order that had destroyed them. Songs and prayers reflected this twisted reverence. Medieval hymns often praised women who suffered with grace or accepted the cross of their fate. Pain became a badge of holiness, and death the crown of devotion. Young girls were taught to dream not of freedom but of peaceful suffering. The more a woman endured, the closer she was said to be to God. Some found comfort in that belief. Others only found exhaustion. In monasteries and convents, the story was more complex. Some women entered those places seeking safety, trading the cruelty of marriage for the cold discipline of religion. Yet even there, the ideals of purity and sacrifice never ceased. When illness or despair struck, they were told it was a test of faith. Their letters, when preserved, speak of loneliness so deep it felt like drowning. A few confessed that they longed for death as their only way to finally rest. Behind the stone walls of piety, despair wore the face of holiness. The state did nothing to help them. Laws against cruelty or forced marriage existed only in theory and were rarely enforced. The idea that a woman's suffering could be unjust simply did not exist. To die for honour was considered noble. To die from sorrow was considered natural, and so, generation after generation, women disappeared quietly into the darkness, their absence mistaken for peace. Yet even within that silence there was a kind of defiance. By choosing death, some women refused to live by rules that stripped them of humanity. Their final act was not surrender, but rejection, a way of saying that they would rather end than obey. History does not know their names, but their choices echo through centuries as a grim reminder of how limited freedom once was. It is haunting to think that their final breaths carried more truth than 1,000 sermons. As time passed, art and literature turned their suffering into beauty. Pain became a story, tragedy a symbol. The deaths of women were painted as delicate, poetic, almost sacred. Viewers admired their purity but ignored their humanity. The same culture that killed them turned them into saints to feel innocent again. It was the most elegant cruelty of all, to worship the suffering you caused. But not every ending was silent. Some women's deaths sparked questions that could not be silenced. Rumours spread, doubts grew, and slowly, change began to take shape. The realization that so many women had chosen death over life forced some to see the system for what it was. The change came late, centuries late, but their deaths had already spoken. They revealed that beneath the medieval facade of faith and morality was an empire built on the suffering of women who had nowhere else to turn. As the centuries passed, the idea of women's worth began to shift. Laws changed, voices rose, and the silence cracked. Yet the memory of those who had no escape lingers, shaping the compassion that came later. Their pain became a shadow history, one that tells us not of power, but of its absence. They remind us that freedom, once denied, can only be understood through those who lived without it. In the end, medieval women were not weak. They were simply left without doors to walk through. Death became the final one, the only passage that no man guarded. The world called them sinners, martyrs, or fools. But they were something far simpler tired souls searching for peace, and if their stories still echo through time, perhaps it is because we sense that they never truly found it. Tonight, may their silence rest softly in your thoughts. Let the sound of their stories fade like candlelight, gentle and distant. Sleep well, and remember that even in the darkest ages, the quiet hearts of women still carried the weight of an entire world. Good night.